ready?
Yes, fire away.
Yes,
You ready?
How are you, Dave? Good, how are you? How's your house? Good, next week. Awesome, congrats. Thanks.
All right, cool. So we're good, ready?
Yeah,
All right, well, we'll get started here. So, first item here for our study session is the transportation land use relationship. Now, this was a topic that got brought up, I think, at our retreat back in February as an important issue to the city. And so Jeff Crick with the planning department is here to give us an overview.
Certainly.
Go for it.
All right. Thanks for having me today. I will kind of keep this a little high level and a little bit on the short side so I have room for questions, and that way if you have details, we can always talk about it. Again, I'm Jeff Crick with the planning office. I think of transportation land use as really being the same thing, and that's probably a little different than a lot of planners do it, but I usually use this photo as an example to the why here. We can all recognize where this is at, but there's two components when you take a look at that you end up talking about. You end up talking about the street, and you end up talking about the buildings. And the easiest way I always think about it is really you're not going to get one without the other. And we'll kind of go through the details of that one, but a lot of planners will talk to you about, it's all about the buildings, it's all about the interaction, it's all about the connectivity, those kind of things. But really when you get down to it, the transportation sometimes has the biggest effect on the way that the buildings work, and also really picks on why certain places locate in the places that they do along the way. For me, it's also a little bit about, when you start talking about equal and direct influences, the effects of a vehicle space on a building dictates exactly what you're going to get. You don't typically see stores located in very particular ways unless you have that kind of atmosphere. You think of your big box stores, they locate where there's a lot of space for parking, there's a lot of activity, there's a lot of in and out activities that can go on there. But those are the really ones that you can directly connect to and see. And we'll talk about the way that this kind of transpires into our building codes and our development codes here in a little bit. But I also want to bring up something about indirect influences. If you really boil it down and really look at the way it is, if you plan for cars and traffic, you typically get cars and traffic. And when you really sit down and plan for people and places, you get people and places. So when you look at Massachusetts Street, it was planned for people and places and somewhere to be. And that's the way that it kind of carries out in the way it looks. Transportation is a very similar thing. You plan for vehicles and traffic, you're going to get that kind of an item out of it usually. It's really in the way that planning kind of works in through Horizon 2020 and also you see in Plan 2040 is those streets are trying to become destinations to visit. They're not just a means to get to an end. They're somewhere you can be along the way. So if you're bicycling, if you just want to take a walk, or if you just want to experience something different, that's a good way of kind of getting out there and doing it. The other side of this is they are very coordinated in their implementation. So when you set a land use pattern or you're doing a future land use plan such as Horizon 2020 or Transportation 2040, you are really setting what that implementation will look like 10, 15, 20 years down the line. And then that really goes right into talking about where does the community put its efforts and its improvement money. So if we're talking about doing certain streets improvements, trying to like 6th Street, you start doing lanes and traffic and those kind of things, that's one type of improvement. But are you also looking at the way that it improves the property that is adjacent to it or the access points to it? So this is really how the planning office kind of views the documents in whole here. Horizon 2020 and Transportation 2040 are effectively linked. So probably you're all aware is that Transportation 2040 is the transportation chapter for Horizon 2020. We just incorporate it right in there by reference. Those two documents then lead out and become what you tend to see as the development code. The land development code and the subdivision regulations all take root and stem from those two plans coming out. So the development code, for lack of a better way to describe it, it really focuses on private property. It doesn't really deal much in the rights of way. It is very much intended to be for development on private property. Transportation 2040 is really what drives the hierarchy of our street planning that we use. And that feeds back into the comprehensive plan, which we'll talk about, and a little bit going into the future land uses that we prescribe as we go forward. It's really the subdivision regulations and those engineering specifications that are generated based on those items that really set out how the right-of-way looks. So Horizon 2020, and I'll touch briefly on our follow-up one here, which is Plan 2040, This is the document that is the overall vision for the community. This outlines all of our guides for our future decisions for land uses. It evaluates our proposals that we look out there. So when the Planning Commission is looking at a rezoning or the City Commission is looking at an annexation, they're leaning very heavily on this document to guide them in the practice of what they should be doing. What it really has done is it's throughout its entire time of being a public document is that's the community's vision. That was lined up and set out about 20 years ago now, saying this is the community that we'd like to be. This is what we value as a whole, and this is what we think we want to see in our community in the future. So it's really always had in mind that community interest. To just give you a kind of a brief overview, Horizon 2020 started in 1991, and the planning process ceased in 96. It was adopted in 1998, so it's been kind of the overarching plan since the development code was adopted back in 2006. There is about 12 to 14 sector plans that really comprise Horizon 2020. And we had the benefit of during the recession to be able to take some staff time and really go around the city of Lawrence and start looking at the future land uses and the way that they would connect to the city as a whole. So while the recession had some very negative items out there, we were able to at least try to get a silver lining out of it in doing those future land use plans. But they really are used as a whole to kind of evaluate the appropriateness of a land use proposal and kind of really make sure that we're meeting that interest that the public has in the community. So I mentioned earlier, Transportation 2040 is Chapter 8. Then I'm sure you've all read cover to cover Transportation 2040, right? It's a quick read. It's like you get on an airplane, you read it, you're done, about 500 some pages. You need a long flight with that one, but we, instead of trying to recreate the wheel about 10, 15 years ago, we stopped having a transportation chapter in Horizon 2020 because we realized there was a lot of good work going on in Transportation 2020 and Transportation 2030. And we said, you know what, let's just bring that in. All that public input, all that research, all that value has been just so good to us. Let's just roll it in there. So that is actually Chapter 8 of Horizon 2020. And it really stresses those emphasis points that you see there. It's really about options and choices and the way that you move about the community. It links land use very well and kind of brings that linkage to a full circle. It really looks at safety and security of all users and modes and trying to make sure that it's efficient and equitable throughout the community. And it's a noble goal, and it's not an easy reach to get to, but it is something that we're rolling into the comprehensive plans. So the reason we're kind of here is to talk about those connections to it, and this is where I think we really start putting where the rubber meets the road, if you'll forgive the pun on that one there a little bit. Comprehensive plan is the community vision. It sets the goals, it outlines what the community has for expectations, and that filters down into becoming the land development code. That land development code then filters into the subdivision regulations, and when you really start seeing this come into the community is through our development application processes. That's when you see something, a building going down and a building going up, or a change in the site and the way they're working about it. It really comes from those development applications, but as you can see there, that's about 3 steps away from the comprehensive plan. So what we tend to do is we always talk about the comp plan as being a guide, an aspirational document. It's where the community wants to be going. Zoning is the implementation and action items of the comprehensive plan. All the stuff you see in the comprehensive plan has to get translated into code to be effective, and that is what we do with the land development code. Those subdivision regulations are a part of our land development code, and that dictates the way that land is divided, subdivided, combined, the way that rights of way work around it. Planning Commission usually sees this quite a bit, and we talk about the amount of rights of way that occur inside of development parcels, and those are dictated based on Transportation 2040, and sometimes those require variances, or sometimes you see dedications of rights of way as they start to move through there. But really, it's the comprehensive plan that transforms the way the zoning codes are written and the way that they're applied, and then that affects the development applications that you see in the community. So to kind of give you a very rapid crash course on a document that is about 524 pages long, the land development code has a lot of different articles inside of it. Article 6 is our density and dimensional standards. This is probably the one that we're all very familiar with, setbacks, heights, those kind of details for a site development item there. We have an entire chapter, Article 9, that is related to parking and all the associated items related to parking. I will put out there that we have a text amendment that's been in the process since about 2013 to review the parking standards to see, are they too little, too much, need more here, need a little less over there. So we're still reviewing that text amendment to kind of figure that out. Article 8, which I highlighted there, is a big one, and there is an odd reason why I put 9 ahead of 8 in the slide here. Article 9 is really when we start talking about development patterns. And Article 8 is all about subdivision regulations, and it's all about how the land is divided and how it is conformed to the zoning that's in place. 10, we talk about landscaping and screening, and really 13 is the part we talk about the development procedures and the processes that are involved with that one there. All of these, believe it or not, have a transportation component to it. The reason I put 9 ahead of 8 in this slide, while not exactly always the best way to kind of go about it, is parking and density dimensionals are really what drives a site to be built. They're the two things when you really look at a site, as somebody developer that comes in, they say, I need a building of this square footage, and then planners will always say, if your building is this many square feet, you need this many parking spaces. And then that drives maybe the land division that occurs after it. So if you start thinking about it in terms of the development application, the building is not necessarily always the driver, the amount of land that's in use or the amount of that. It's usually sometimes the parking. And that is sometimes a coefficient of the zoning. It's sometimes a coefficient of the transportation network. So when we look through this as a planner, we kind of hop around. We go from 6 to 10 to 8, and we come back to it. But everything is governed under 13, and that tells us exactly how to process site plans, and it's how we keep David here quite busy with a lot of reviews and different items. So, is anybody familiar with our subdivision regulations? Maybe one person, a couple, little? It's okay if you're not. It's one of those really technical planning things here. You can see the one on the right there is actually the plat document. The one on the left is the subdivision actually being built here in the community here. The subdivision regulations are a function of a comprehensive plan by state law. You have to have a comprehensive plan adopted before you can do subdivision regulations in the state of Kansas. And that law requires that they have to do certain things, including, but not limited to, the efficient and orderly location of streets, the reduction of vehicular congestion, the reservation of land for open spaces, off-site and on-site public improvements, which may be bicycle facilities, sidewalks, connections, and those sorts, and also recreational facilities that may or may not be limited to land for park purposes. So that all stems from the state law, and that's why we do subdivision regulations. But the real reason that you kind of want to do these subdivision regulations is you can start laying out street networks and seeing those connection patterns and start putting it into formation of why streets do some of the things that they do. And that kind of leans back into Transportation 2040 about the way that gridding works or the why we do street connections. One thing I'll kind of plug is in Plan 2040, which is the comprehensive plan that we have currently up for consideration, is it starts talking about things in terms of connective patterns. And that was kind of in Horizon 2020, but we really tried to bring that up because there was a lot of issue action items that was identified at the steering committee and also at the planning commission for things that needed to be better. It was good in Horizon 2020, but we could be doing better as a community. And so those things really started to step up in that documentation. So before I go on, I will stop right there. Any questions about subregs? I know it's an enthralling topic.
I have lots of questions. Can we go back a slide or two?
Certainly.
To the development code? Let's go there. Parking, loading, and access. What do you mean by access?
Usually it involves access to a site. So if you're talking about how you come and go from certain streets, like you can't come, I'm thinking of an access restriction, like you can have a curb cut to 6th Street, but you can have it to the side street. Or if you have an access easement where you're trying to make people share a curb cut, so you minimize those amounts of curb cuts and breaks in the sidewalks and the travel lanes, that is what it is. It'll also sometimes talk about loading docks and facilities, about other larger uses of vehicles.
Okay, now let's go back to Article 6, density and dimensional standards.
Mm-hmm.
With our new urban density focus, are we still requiring all that parking that we did before? Or are we going to adapt to more of an inner city situation?
That is to be determined. Plan 2040, if it is adopted, does not automatically change any of the land development code. That has to come from a series of text amendments that are initiated by the city commission or the planning commission to bring that aspirational goal into the code. So if Plan 2040 is adopted tomorrow, the land development code is still the land development code until a text amendment is initiated.
And there are people discussing this, or?
City Commission has been discussing this for quite a while. Every year, typically, the planning office will generate a work plan, and we'll submit it for the county commission, the city commission, and the planning commission to consider and say, these are the things that we have staff time to do. This is what we think is the best priorities to be looking at based on what we're hearing in the community. Would you guys agree with the priority, or would you like to change that? So, there's a lot of different things that go on in that one, but it is something that's been brought up.
Okay, let's go to the next slide now.
Sure.
One of the things we have noticed, I'll speak for myself, one of the things I have noticed is it's very hard to put bus routes on the west side of the city. How are we addressing that so that we can make it easier for new development to have access to a city bus?
Well, that's usually a function of a subdivision regulation like that. And it's usually we start talking about the connective street patterns and things in there. And the way that the subdivision regulations are currently lined out is those connections don't always have to be done. And this plat is a great example of that. You don't have to make those connections in a whole sometimes. It does ask for pedestrian connections, that you link the sidewalks. You make those connections as a whole there. But right now, the way that it's kind of structured is, the way that code is written is what you're kind of seeing come on the ground there. The other important thing to keep in mind is when you're usually seeing a house being built, it's already been 3 or 4 years in the works already. So it's already been kind of long laid out and underway before it even starts to get a building permit. And some of those have been there for quite a while. There's a couple of plats here in town that are probably getting up 18 to 20 years that are still in development. And they were first thought of, platted, laid out back in 2000, 2002. So there's a long transition with these kind of documents. Well, I'll kind of talk a little bit about the thing that really is when you start seeing these things hit the ground, which is our development application types. One thing that I think is always important to note is that we have 3 different levels of site plans here in the city of Lawrence, and the way that we do it is based upon what the project is proposed to do. I'll work backwards down the list, which is actually how the planners do it too. A major development plan would be effectively knocking a whole site down and coming back from bare earth and redeveloping it. And at that point, everything is in play and is applicable to land development code. So just because your parking didn't meet the code today, as soon as you remove it in your major development plan, you're coming up to all the modern land development code requirements. Sidewalk connections, bicycle parking, parking spaces, landscaping, the whole 9 yards.
Excuse me, Jeff, when you say sidewalk connections, sidewalk connections to what?
It can be either to the parking lot, it can also be towards the building, but the land development code requires that you have a connection between the sidewalk, a public right-of-way, I think for the way the code says, and to the building. So it doesn't prescribe necessarily treatments on how to get to it, it just says it has to be there. And so the minor site plan is one where it's really, it's almost like it's an administrative review. You take a look at it and say, this use is compatible to that use, it has enough parking to proceed, and it just proceeds down the line there. Site plans are almost all administrative items. They're a function of the planning director, and he can approve them, and there's an appeal process involved into it. But site plans are really an administrative item. They're very ministerial in that process and loop. Special use permits, institutional development plans, and plan developments require city commission approval and review. So those are ones where we would take it to the planning commission for a recommendation. They would take a look at it, and that recommendation is forwarded to the city commission for their consideration and their approval. Those are ones that are usually more formed out in the design, the shape, the function, kind of, they go through almost the entire process before they even get considered on that one. So they will be very detailed drawings that by the time they hit those boards. We will also take into look what I call zoning applications, but really if you think about it, it's a rezoning or an annexation. So if you want to add land to the city of Lawrence, or if you want to change a residential parcel to a commercial parcel, those require hearings before the planning commission and also the city commission. Those aren't really necessarily development proposals, but it kind of starts that groundwork in the formation for those items in there. And of course, anything that's in the land development code can have a variance or an appeal based upon it. It usually goes to the Board of Zoning Appeals, which is another body the planning office runs. So it's got a lot of hoops in there. But really, the site plans, the reason I highlighted that one there, that is the one that you tend to see when you start seeing something come on the ground. So a building being built or a new parking lot being constructed, they typically originate from a site plan function. So, and that again is about 3 steps below the comprehensive plan. So what was lined up in the comprehensive plan in 1998 transitioned to the Land Development Code in 2006. It is coming on the ground in 2019.
So if a development of some sort wants to annex to the city,
Mhm.
that's what they want to do, how do we make sure that there's adequate city bus access and pedestrian access, bicycle, whatever? How do we make sure that happens?
Usually at this point, you'd be talking about, because it's gonna be a long ways off, an annexation to a building permit is quite a long distance in time there. It's gonna have to be in the codes, to be quite honest with you on that one. If it's not an aspect that's required in the land development code or in the subdivision regulations or the engineering specifications, then there's not really much for staff to kind of push and move in that line
And
there.
where is that kind of thing generated?
Usually from a text amendment or initiated by the city commission. So one thing I think people always have in the vision of the planning office is that we can go out and say, you have to do this, you have to do that. We really don't have that ability. It's what the code is what the code is. And if it says, I'll give you a great example, one is, you have to connect the front door to a public sidewalk. That's where the code stops. It doesn't say it has to be to a certain sidewalk or it has to be in a certain run of a distance, typically outside of ADA considerations. It just has to make that connection. It leaves that location and the technicalities of that up to the landowner to figure out what works best with their site. So some of those things are a little bit beyond us on that one. We can mandate the connection, but we can't say it has to be this type of pavement with this type of connection.
Okay, so let's take Target as an example.
Okay.
The city bus goes on that frontage road,
Sure.
and then you have to negotiate the parking lot on foot,
Mhm.
or wheels, or whatever you've got. Is that the best that we can do?
Personally, I would say probably not. But as a planner, I don't have code authority to go out there and make a change.
So someone has to initiate the code authority.
Well, they'd have to come in and redevelop under today's rules. That project is an interesting one because it was built under the 1966 zoning code. So it's prior to land development code, which has a lot of those different items, because the land development code has a requirement for pedestrian connections, including pathways, so you can to and from the door and make different items for larger parking lots.
Okay, and the lot that's being torn up next to Perkins, I don't see a sidewalk headed towards a building.
I don't know what's going in that one particularly. Now, just replacing a parking lot doesn't necessarily trigger the land
Well,
development
The
code.
whole block is torn up there. And what about the Sprint store? There's no door on the front.
That's a function of the community design manual sometimes, and that's a different document altogether. Now, we can't prescribe necessarily where doors are located on buildings based on that document. That's wholly up to the landowner to choose on how they'd like to orient the building. Their guidelines themselves will say you have to orient in certain ways and advocates for putting parking behind buildings in different functions, but that doesn't necessarily
But it
always.
doesn't say the pedestrian has access to the building?
Not necessarily. The community design manual is more of an aesthetic manual related to the architectural design and site aesthetics, not necessarily that. Usually the connections are coming from the land development code. And it again goes back to those site planning levels. If it's not triggered under the higher level of review, if they're not doing enough to reach that major or that standard site planning, then planners don't really have a chance to kind of push that as an item sometimes. Actually, believe it or not, that's all I got, so. I would be happy to answer any questions along this kind of lines with the land development code or the comprehensive plan or any number of planning related things. I'd be happy to give it a try today.
Well, are you ready for our questions, Jeff?
Absolutely.
I guess I'd start with kind of a big picture question in terms of, you see how all this stuff works, with the planning commission and the city commission and your department. And I'm sure you know enough about what we do, to kind of see what's going on here.
Yeah.
I guess my question would be, how do you think we could be most helpful as a transportation commission, giving, we have people on this commission that really can get into the weeds very intelligently with everything that's going on in the city. And, that's great that we bring that to the table. But if you just look at it from a bigger picture, what would you say? You guys, these are the things you ought to be thinking about. These are the things that you really ought to be conscious of and making making comments on.
I would say, with the comprehensive plan being pretty far along in the way that's going, I would look at Plan 2040 and maybe, I'm kind of going on a limb here a little bit, but I'd say probably put out there what you see in Plan 2040 as being priorities that mesh with the Transportation Commission's priorities, or things that you see that maybe they should be moved up the work list because you're seeing it quite a lot here, and maybe it's not transitioning its way to Planning Commission or even through development applications. You tend to be more attuned to those items, I think, than any other body in the city, and being able to say, these are the items we see as being a priority and that we're hearing from the community, this needs to be higher up that work plan. I think that's a great spot to be, is just to kind of give us that guidance and tell us where you're seeing the issues rise up. It's kind of, we always describe the Board of Zoning Appeals as being the canary in the coal mine for the land development code. When you start seeing a lot of variances or you start seeing a lot of hiccups with that board, it usually tells you there's something a little amiss with the way that the world works and the way that the code wants to work. I think it's kind of a very similar way to Transportation Commission. You're kind of that canary identifying the issues and saying, this is what we really should be looking on, and yes, this is a very important priority, but we're also saying this one is too. And maybe kind of raise it up a little bit, raise its profile, if you will.
So you're suggesting use T2040 as kind of a filter?
I would use T2040, I'd use Plan 2040 and Horizon 2020. Well, Horizon 2020 until Plan 2040 is through its full course. But I think the comprehensive plan and T2040 are really the big lenses that we use to kind of guide those text amendments and the way the codes change and react. But there's a lot of really great work that's been done in Transportation 2040. I think it's a good one to kind of focus the effort on, truthfully.
Questions, folks?
Hey, Jeff. I'm wondering if this group wanted to look at a text amendment as a possibility, how would we go about doing that?
Typically, a text amendment would be initiated by the City Commission or the Board of County Commissioners. The Planning Commission can also initiate text amendments in instances too. But usually most of the text amendments that the planning office works on is a letter is written to letter is written to the City Commission requesting a text amendment and outlining a little bit about what the hope is for it, what do we want them to look at, and then the planning staff is then either directed to get to work on that item, or we kind of figure out how we go about those things. Actually, I was in this room about 4 or 5 hours ago talking about another text amendment. It was initiated by tenants to homeowners for the Affordable Housing Advisory Board, and they submitted a text amendment to review densities on lots. And that was initiated by the City Commission, and then we were sent to work to kind of work that out. To give you an idea on those things, that text amendment started back in October of 18, and we're still working on it today. So they have some longevity. It's not a quick item, but it can be initiated by those bodies and then directed to kind of begin the process.
Given the nature of transportation now, are there any ways that you're already adapting in planning?
The change in the way the role of the transportation is working. One thing that we've been talking about lately, and it's been high level, we're trying to figure it out ourselves here, is you're starting to see shifts in the way that people think about moving. And I think that there's one part of the comprehensive plan that always jumps out at me is we spend a lot of time going through public input sessions, and even in the county and even in the west side of Lawrence, the east side, didn't matter what part of Lawrence we were in, everybody said, I'm tired of driving to just go and pick up one thing. Or I'd like to have the option to walk down the street and get a sandwich. I don't want to drive to a restaurant. I want to just have it in my backyard. So one thing we kind of looked at with the steering committee and what we kept seeing was reintroducing commercial into neighborhoods to give that option so you didn't always have to get in the car and drive to the shopping center. I'm not saying we've got it all sorted out, we've got it all kind of details figured out, but that I think is some of the changes we're starting to see in the way that land use is playing out, is that people are really wanting to they don't want to do that. They want to walk to the corner, pick something up. One thing the steering committee heard, and the planning commission I think heard quite a bit too, is you start talking about people about aging in place. And it's a little bit departure from the transportation side a little bit, but one thing we heard quite a lot, and this has been from every angle in the county, is I love my neighborhood. I don't want to leave my neighborhood, but there's not housing for me in this neighborhood, so I have to go. And they don't want that. So trying to think about designing a place for all ages, for all abilities, incomes, whatever it is in those aspects, and trying to change the way that we look at zoning as a whole, where it has to be a single type with a single use and a single shape, and kind of going away from what you kind of see in those modern codes. Now, I don't know how far we're gonna get along the way there, but it's starting to be the things you hear about, is people really want to change the way that a city looks, and the way you do that is you start changing that land use, because that land use feeds back into the way that you build your infrastructure. We were talking about bus routes on the west side of town there. There's a reason why those are so hard, is because you have a lot of streets of a certain type. East side of Lawrence, south side doesn't really have that same street type nearly as frequently. So trying to work that into the subdivision regulations, work that into the zoning code is kind of those next steps. But, you know, I think really we're gonna have to really start thinking about it. And it was always described to me as the Grandpa and Jennifer test. Is a neighborhood built for someone under the age of 8 and over the age of 80? Can they move about in the way that they want to, safely, conveniently, and reach the destinations they want? I don't think we maybe have necessarily done that sometimes in the past, and we need to be probably a little bit better about it.
So do you keep track of the housing stock and its use?
Here? Yes. About, you know, you get kind of the big round numbers, 55% of the community is rental, give or take a little bit, 45 is owner occupied. You can usually do striations across the community. Your highest 1/3 income earners will be living in Lawrence and commuting somewhere else every day. Your middle 1/3 will usually be in Lawrence and work in Lawrence. Your lowest income 1/3 will work in Lawrence every day but live somewhere else. So we track the commuting patterns, we track the ownership rates, we track a lot of different dynamics and parameters.
I was thinking about what you were saying about seniors wanting to age in place, place being the neighborhood.
Exactly.
It frees up a lot of family housing if you can give them a place to move.
And that's one thing we look at with the Affordable Housing Advisory Board and those directives, is trying to figure out what is the pattern that people want. And that's sometimes up to the market, and it's hard to do because, you know, I'm by no means an economist, and I'm by no means a realtor. So it's harder to figure out what that is and the way that it works, but we track it, but I don't know if there's any definitive movement in one way or the other in those patterns at the moment.
What kinds of things could we do now that wouldn't cost? Like, if a parking lot is redone, could we ask that it be redone in a way that's more amenable to bicycles and pedestrians?
It's a possibility, yes. That could be an option there. The thing to remember is sometimes just doing general maintenance on a property doesn't trigger the land development code. The property owner has the ability to go out and fix a pothole or repaint it or do something that wouldn't trigger a code required review. They go out and put in landscaping, or they're changing, you know, more impervious surface or less impervious surface. That would start introducing parts of you getting into a standard site plan, which was what we're kind of talking about with this one. You start going back into those site planning levels, and then the staff has the ability to look and review at those items that are being touched as part of the process.
Or maybe some kind of an incentive program?
Also a possibility.
And how do we initiate something like that?
I don't know about an incentive program. That usually comes from the economic development coordinator with the city, would be my best guess, but it's not something the planning office typically works on.
Anybody else? Aaron, any thoughts?
Thoughts, I don't know if they're necessarily, I mean, I can say from being on Transportation and Planning Commission, I still always feel like I can't quite figure out how to I think one thing that comes up a lot is you see a lot of stuff come to Planning Commission that you know the direction we're trying to go, but you know where we're at now. And a lot of our policies and codes sort of funnel you into, I want to say continuing what we already have, or not being able to sort of shift directions, but we often don't even have that ability or opportunity because the developer, just builds whatever the code requires. And so one thing I always struggle with is feeling like, are we really going in the right direction? Have we actually shifted to that plan, to the plan that hasn't been approved, the land use plan? Are we meeting that aspiration? And that's something I grapple with a lot. So that's more of a statement, not a question, but I often wonder, like, how do we get there? Or what can I look at? Where have they done something else that you can look and say, hey, here's what their plan has and here's why they chose to do something, and here's the code that enabled it to happen, if that makes any sense.
It's hard for planners too, I think in a lot of ways, is because you sit there and we talk about Plan 2040 and it has these big visions. It's talking about a county-wide community vision for it, and we all kind of know what that is. And then you look at the land development code, which really takes its roots in Horizon 2020, which was done back in the early 90s. And then it's hard to reconcile what you want to be versus what your codes are saying you are going to be. And it takes time. The fortunate part is I'm not a patient person. Sometimes when I come to those things, I want the code changed now. I want to see all these good things we're talking about. I want it tomorrow. Like, it's like Amazon Prime, next day delivery. I want that. It's hard to sometimes relate it back to those kind of things there. The way it was described to me when I first really got into planning was a zoning code is state of the art 20 years ago. And that's usually the best it will ever be. It's always about 20 years behind, because by the time you go through a text amendment or even a full rewrite, it might not necessarily align with the comprehensive plan that you have at the moment, which is tough because we all want that vision that we talked about in Plan 2040. It's a time thing. It's just a matter of getting it worked out there. Of course, the land development code is the first one, and then you got to talk about the subdivision regulations, and then talk about how does that transition into site development applications. And it takes quite a while. To give kind of a rough estimate, the land development code for the city was done in 2006. That was on the back of Horizon 2020 being done in 1998. And we did the subdivision regulations and the zoning code at the same time. So you're really starting to see on the ground today some of the stuff that would have been to the code in 2006 when it was first developed as the land development code. And it's changed over time, and there's been a number of text amendments, but in whole, it's really got its roots in about 2006. It's a patience. It's a long game. It's the best way to describe it sometimes.
I was in Des Moines, Iowa earlier this summer, on a bicycle trip, and I don't know if you've been up there, but they have shared use paths all the way through their suburbs. So from any point, and Des Moines is a big sprawling suburban city, and you can go anywhere from way out on the west side of town to downtown without ever going on a street. And that's for pedestrians and cyclists. And I took a lot of pictures just because I'm pretty fascinated. I mean, and this has been in place for quite a while, but we were riding out to the northwest part of the city. We went out of the city limits about 5 miles. They were building a new subdivision. They had part of the streets done. They had clearly platted where the lots were going to be, but they already had the bike path done, completely paved. So I think that's kind of what you're talking about. It's just you set this as a priority and you make it happen in new development. And it just seems, I guess I get frustrated with, it's hard to go back and change something that's already set, because you have to take a piece of land away from somebody to make this wide path. But if you put that in at the beginning, then you don't have that issue. And I get frustrated too doing it now.
That's it to me, and I'm not familiar with the area to know exactly how to do it, but it sounds like to me they probably would have had a transportation plan that would have given a very prescriptive setting of a street, and then that got transitioned right into their subdivision regulations saying if it's going to be on this street, it's going to be an extra right of way so that we can do this amenity item here. And that's when you start talking about moving from transportation 2040 into subdivision regulations for us. And there's a portion of 6th Street that has an extra large right-of-way because it was adopted by ordinance, and it's something in our subdivision regulations today that I believe it's maybe from Monterey or Folks. I can't remember where it starts at, and it goes all the way to the west, and it's an extra large right-of-way for kind of for that purpose, to have those other amenities in there and also to have that building setback kind of be affected. But it's one of those things where it's like you set it up and then you really hope in the years that come along that that's adhered to, it's a community value, and it just slowly works its way into those development applications as they come in.
So when you develop, I forgot the right terms now,
Oh, it's okay.
the site development code, whatever,
Yeah.
is there any reference to the transportation chapter when you do that?
In the very opening of the land development code, it says this plan, or excuse me, this code shall conform to Horizon 2020, or the comprehensive plan, actually, I think is what it says, because plans can come and go. And then all the stuff that the planners will look at when they're going through that, they're gonna look at the code first, but if it has roots in some of those other plans, they can kind of go back to it. So something we usually talk about with, it's usually with zoning and annexations is where you really kind of talk about those more often than not. For like a site development application, it's almost always going to be rooted in the land development code because it has to be based in the code that you're reviewing and applying to the property. But there is a provision in the very opening land development code that refers back to the comprehensive plan, kind of makes that link. And then Transportation 2040 is the chapter in Horizon 2020, so it's in that same link.
Well, if we don't have any other questions, gee, thanks, Jeff.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Good job. This is the only item on our,
That's the only item, so we'll
okay,
adjourn and pick back up at 6.
sounds good. We don't need to wait for Nick, do we? Okay. Good evening, everybody.
Yep, all the sinks are like 40 inches or something like that.
I think we'll get started. Welcome, everybody. This is the September 9th, 2019 Transportation Commission regular meeting. And as usual, we start out with general public comment. Go through our standard paragraph here so everybody's on the same page. Public is allowed to speak to any items or issues
Steve?
that are not
Steve,
scheduled on the regular agenda.
can we start with the minutes?
Oh, I'm sorry. Missed that. Item number 1, approve the regular meeting minutes for August 5th, 2019.
So moved.
Second.
Moved by John and seconded by Charlie. All those in favor, raise your hand, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes. Sorry about that. I'll try it again. General public comment. Public is allowed to speak to any items or issues that are not scheduled on the regular agenda. Public comment will not be received for staff items, commission items, or calendar. Each person or organization will be limited to 3 minutes. As a general practice, the commission will not discuss, debate these items, nor will the commission make decisions on items presented at this time. Individuals are asked to come to the microphone, sign in, state their name and address. Speakers should address all comments to the commission. So, do we have any general public comment this evening? Please come up to the podium if you do. Okay, having none, let's move on to item number 3, the East 23rd Street Corridor Study. Always like to just tell everybody that we're receiving the presentation and providing feedback on the East 23rd Street Planning Study. Hi, Jessica.
Hi, I'm Jessica Mortinger. I'm the Transportation Planning Manager for the Lawrence Douglas County Metropolitan Planning Organization. And I'm going to introduce to you tonight our consultants to present the work they've done on this corridor study. In the meantime, I'd just like to let you know this was a study we applied for competitive consolidated planning grant funding to KDOT, and were awarded $80,000 to fund a $100,000 study. And this is the result of the work where we can envision what this corridor looks like for the future. So, Jeff and Teresa.
Good evening. Thank you for having us. My name is Teresa Carter-Hawes. I was one of the main planners on this project. I am with Olson, and I'm here tonight with Jeff McCarrow. He was the lead engineer on this project. So Jessica mentioned the funding that helped the project go into play, but with the Complete Streets project, that necessitates that anytime there's a major construction project, you look at Complete Streets elements and like multimodal functionality. So with the pending design and reconstruction of East 23rd Street, it made it a good time for us to be taking a look at this corridor. We also have a traffic analysis that we incorporated to look at level of service, like congestion, and also where a lot of crashes were happening, to better understand how we could address those in the future with our recommendations. There had been some ongoing studies and updates related to the bicycle and pedestrian network within Lawrence and countywide, namely the Lawrence Bikes Plan. And you will see that those recommendations are directly incorporated into this study's recommendations. And with the opening of the South Lawrence Trafficway, there have been changing development patterns along 23rd Street, which also necessitated another look, and just making sure that this main gateway into Lawrence was really representative of the city within. So our corridor study area is these dark blue lines here. And that was the actual project limit. So that is where all of the recommendations that Jeff will come up and talk about, that is where they are concentrated. The actual construction is going to happen from the Haskell Bridge to about 600 feet east of Anderson Avenue, which is where 23rd Street starts to split here. So we looked at a broader corridor area just to make sure that in the future, if there were to be any reconstruction or construction along different parts of 23rd Street, the recommendations would be continuous throughout this entire project limit. And also to make sure we were being holistic in all of our recommendations, this area in the dark gray that's outlined represents a 1/4 mile buffer area around our 23rd Street project limits, so that we could make sure we were incorporating other planning studies and efforts that were going on and would directly or indirectly influence transportation patterns along 23rd Street. The main one I mentioned already is the Lawrence Bikes Plan. So we did a lot of public engagement with this project. That's something that is very important for any project that we do at Olson, and also something that MPO in the city feels very strongly about. So we had both online and in-person means that the public could interact with. One of the main things we did online was a public survey, and we asked people how they primarily interact with 23rd Street in its current state today. And unsurprisingly, nearly 90% of people said that they primarily just drive along the corridor. So we also wanted to then understand how comfortable people feel using the different means of travel along this roadway. So we asked them how comfortable they felt driving, walking, or bicycling to get a better understanding of how people feel in its current state today. The last thing we asked were what the main goals people wanted to see come out of the project. So just trying to understand what they really wanted to see in the recommendations portion moving forward. So we used that online survey and coupled that with our in-person 3-day charrette period, where our planning team, our landscape architects, and our engineering staff came out to Lawrence. We were out at the Douglas County Fairgrounds for a 3-day period to perform what we call a charrette. And this is where we invited any interested member of the general public, as well as our project advisory committee members and our steering committee members, to join us for a visioning workshop and then a charrette period to follow. So these program priorities you see on the screen was what we used for our visioning workshop. So we broke everybody out into 6 groups with each of these different topic areas, and we started having people tell us what they really wanted to see in terms of access management, like how many driveways there are along the corridor, things like landscaping, how they wanted to be able to bike or walk along the corridor. And we started to really narrow down from a list of 40 to 50 bullet points per category into these streamlined, consensus-built, just a couple of bullet points per topic. So we use this as a jumping off point then for the rest of our 3-day period together to start really drawing actual concepts that people could look at. So you can see in some of the photos, there's aerials and trace paper over. We have sticky notes everywhere and red and blue dots. And we started to really ask people, what do you like about this? What do you not like? Anything people liked, we started forming and putting those ideas together. And ultimately, what Jeff is going to come up and talk about now, the recommendations we came up with at the end of this 3-day period are the recommendations you'll see in the plan today. So we truly followed a very robust engagement process. We came with no concepts generated initially. We put them together alongside the members of the Lawrence community and our stakeholder committees, and that's what Jeff is going to come up and share with you all now.
Thank you, Teresa. Jeff McCare with Olson. Thank you for having us here tonight. And I think what you've heard was this really was a consensus-built plan when we got and met with a lot of the publics. I wanted to step kind of high level and talk about some of the generalities that was influenced from what we heard, influenced by the data we looked at, the crash history along the corridor as well. We basically started with a corridor that, and this is kind of rare in our profession, we had a lot of right-of-way to work with. This was the old K-10 highway. KDOT controlled it. They had at the narrowest section about 120 feet of right-of-way. More than ample space to actually provide some good alternatives for this corridor. So it gave us a lot of opportunities to do that. At the same time, one of those things that we heard from the group was very much wanting to slow some traffic down. Right now, as you go past the Haskell Bridge, and the speed limit goes up to 45 miles an hour at that point. And then when you get a little bit further to O'Connell, it goes up to 55 miles an hour. And the thought was, what could we do to maybe start slowing traffic down a little bit more as we take a look at a lot of businesses that are continuing to reinvest in this corridor so that it feels like it's still part of the city and not the exit to the city. So with that in mind, some of the things we actually looked at was narrowing the lanes. So instead of what we have today on 23rd Street are lanes that are anywhere from 12 to 16 feet wide, to actually bring it down to 11 to 12 foot wide lanes. The section labeled up here for Section A, going from the west end over to Harper Street, we're proposing to have two 11-foot lanes in each direction, and the center turn lane would be 12-foot wide and with either a small median at signalized intersections, or in cases between the intersections, we would just have a center two-way left turn lane. Part of that conversation really came down to understanding the businesses and how they operate along this corridor. We have some relatively narrow lots that are here, and the ability for people to get large deliveries, particularly with some over-the-road trucks for tractor, farm supplies, car dealers. What do they need to be able to get in and out safely and accommodate what we didn't want to have happen, which has happened in some communities when they start to do some things, is have these trucks park on the street to load and unload. So we need to be sure we had flexibility that worked with the community that we had out there. As we move forward, and we'll talk a little bit more about the medians and where those have been strategically placed here in a moment. As you move from the section over to, from Harper Street going west, one of the things that changed there, or pardon me, Harper going east, you actually see that we're talking about going from an 8-foot side use path to a 10-foot side use path. Part of that reason, we did want to recognize that the recently completed studies, the bike plans wanted some sort of facility along this corridor, but we had a lot of driveways on the western section of the corridor. On the eastern section, we got a little bit wider. So what the plan the community worked with was to really come up with an 8-foot shared use path there on the west side, and then as we move forward, it goes to a little bit wider to 10 foot. That's in a location where the driveways are spread out more, and bicyclists, should they be riding on those, would be more comfortable riding at a little bit higher speed, so they're giving them a little bit more width. The cross sections we showed here right now, just to let you know, do represent what would happen if this road were to be reconstructed with an asphalt roadway. If you actually went with concrete, you could narrow it a little bit more. Those options give us a lot of opportunity, and you'll see here in a moment, to look at what you could do in the green space for different amenity zones to begin to change this character a little bit. So when we talk about the desire to slow down traffic a little bit as you come into town here, there's a little bit of psychology that works to that. One is the narrower lanes help. When you have lanes that are as wide as an interstate, you feel like you can drive at interstate speeds. When we narrow those down, that helps control traffic. Doesn't have any tangible impact on the capacity of the roadway, does start to slow and calm the traffic a little bit. The other thing, by introducing some landscape elements in the green space, it's creating much more of a intimate feel that also keeps the drivers from driving and start to drive a little bit slower as they come into town. When we take a look at the bicycle, pedestrian, transit recommendations, we've already mentioned the shared youth paths along this corridor, for the most part coming out with 8 to 10 foot trails. We do have a lot of north-south connections for bicycle facilities that are crossing this. So this path along 23rd Street is really meant to connect the businesses along this corridor to the paths that already exist north and south. We have looked and made a few recommendations on the transit stops. One of them is to look at moving, we have a stop at Harper Street today that is actually a bus turnout. It's on the east side as you leave town. There's a couple issues with that. And it's a big debate on where you have those. One of the tough things with that is when a bus pulls out and you have the traffic volumes you have on 23rd Street, it can be tough for them to get back into traffic, which hurts their performance and reliability as well. What we've actually recommended as we reconstruct this is to move that transit stop just to the west side of that intersection, the signal there, and actually have it like the other stops along 23rd Street so we're consistent where they're stopping in the lane of traffic to get people on and off. But that way they can maintain their schedule and keep their efficiency on their organization. For those of you who have worked with transit agencies, running on time is probably the most important thing they can do. So this is going to help them meet some of those performance measures. We've also identified, as the eastern part of the corridor continues to develop out, over at O'Connell, some potential locations for future bus stops when you start to see enough activity out there. One of the things interesting through this corridor, and when you look into some of the plans and sketches as well, is we have taken notice that today along this corridor, we have bus stops in which you have to load and unload in grass. We don't have amenity zones. We don't have sidewalks. Those are included in this plan, so as the transit users have a solid surface to load and unload on the bus off, hopefully a dry spot that they can stand in waiting for a bus to give them a higher level service than exists today. So we'll step through the corridor a little bit and talk about some of the recommendations that go forward here. Again, what you see from this, we would continue having 2 lanes in each direction in the center turn lane for the majority of this corridor, although it's a narrower corridor than you have today. What that gives that opportunity to not only meander the side use paths, so they're not just necessarily a straight path, but also to introduce some landscaping elements along the corridor to give this really that entryway into the city of Lawrence that we heard from the community they were certainly looking at. The other thing we've done is we are actually recommending to keep this change this to a 35 mile an hour as you approach Haskell Avenue instead of 45. So lowering the speed for this first section of the roadway as you transition out of town. As you move forward and taking a look at some different recommendations, by and large, all the driveways that exist today will exist as this plan goes forward. We'll talk about some future recommendations. The one exception to that is actually the entrance to Quick Trip. As we looked at this corridor, it actually had the highest number of crashes that occurred. In fact, over a 4-year period, there was about 23 crashes that occurred, or about every other month. Most of those occurred as people were turning left out of Quick Trip to go east on 23rd Street, as opposed to accessing the signal at Haskell to operate a little safer as an exit point. Our recommendation actually shows that this would be reconstructed. It's what you'd call a 3/4 intersection. We've got the room to provide left turn stacking we need and allow people to turn left in, as well as right in and right out. So a restricted, partially restricted, everybody can still get in okay. Just leaving, we're asking people if they want to turn left to actually utilize the traffic signal, a safer alternative there. We do on this corridor, when we talk about safety though, we actually are experiencing more wrecks on this corridor, more collisions than you would typically find on a corridor like this in the state of Kansas. Narrowing the lanes, slowing people down is going to help with that. The other thing we've introduced at the signalized intersections is some raised medians, and you'll see that here. The reason for those is those start to, again, define that you're coming up to a signalized intersection. It gives drivers better guidance on where they should be positioning their cars when they're turning on and off as well. Also to just increase that level of safety and how drivers can function through that area. As we move further and cross Harper Street, at Harper is still where we would see that speed limit return to 45 miles an hour. At this point, our driveways are spaced much farther apart. We do still have a median. If you're familiar with the retail shopping center right in this location, kind of on that northeast corner, there is a rather large sweeping island that is attempting to control that, their first driveway to just right turns coming in and out. Fortunately, we've observed, it was observed as we're on the corridor, we saw people doing that. What exists today with that big island was people were able to easily still turn left in and out, sometimes going the wrong direction in that. So we've extended the median a little bit larger so that we're physically prohibiting people from making a left turn out of this driveway or a left turn in. That's the same intent of the driveway as it exists today. We're just cleaning it up with the median of the intersection a little bit better. Moving through the corridor, we'll come back for a moment. We do have some changes here. We've got a apartment driveway and 1575 road that we're looking at some different options. We'll talk on that in just a moment. O'Connell is the next location in which you see that speed limit increase to 55 miles an hour. At this signalized intersection, that continues, kind of that's that transition as you're stepping out of town. If you can think about what we're doing is we're just slowing that exit as you leave Lawrence. We're slowing you down a little bit sooner as you come into town. Talking about this one area that we have we've got a apartment drive on one side, 1575 road on the other. We've got a motel in this area, lots of activities going on. A small outer road that actually curves back up and connects at O'Connell. The drive between the apartment and 1575, this is actually a little bit awkward because the driveways and those intersections don't align with each other today. What they do in this location is what we call they're actually aligned the wrong direction where they're interlocking. If somebody is waiting to turn left into the apartment drive without defined turn lanes in this area, they're occupying the same spaces as if somebody wanted to turn left into 1575 road. So it's the same physical space. What we've introduced is some more medians at this location where traffic could turn left in and they'd come down a little bit further and introduce another point so that they still maintain full access, both in and out. If you're turning left in, you come in here, you can't turn directly out of the apartment, but you can turn and make a U-turn to move. We've actually flared this intersection out to allow for that. And the same thing as you're exiting from 1575 road, the ability that if you wanted to head east, you've got that option to either make a U-turn or continue up to the traffic signal at O'Connell. Both improving those safeties, still maintaining that full access to those properties though. Just not quite as direct. As we went through this corridor, we did identify some opportunities to consider closing some driveways in the future, to consider realigning. For instance, this one shows Ponderosa Drive getting realigned. These are improvements that we see as possible should redevelopment occur on adjacent properties, should a business come in and want to change how they operate. Some ideas on this segment between Harper and Haskell in particular where you could think about changes in the future. The struggle with this corridor though is we've got some relatively very narrow lots. So unless those lots are being joined to the others, it might be difficult to combine some driveways. And that's just the reality of what we're dealing with here. So we've recommended and provided some ideas. These are, again, when redevelopment occurs, it's not necessarily a, let's go do this now. The other thing to keep in mind, some of these are fairly intense retail or commercial uses, lots of truck traffic. On a narrow lot, you might not be able to actually fully pull somebody in, back around, and get out the same entrance. You might need two driveways in some locations just to provide some of that truck movement. That's preferable over having somebody stop on the road to load and unload. And lastly, I want to talk a little bit about a couple other safety intersections to look at. One of them is at Franklin Road. Today, that's a kind of an interesting, this is as you're still moving in, the speeds are 55 miles an hour at this location. We've got some interesting acceleration and deceleration lanes that exist today. We're recommending a treatment here that's called a Turbo T. It's been utilized in a lot of different locations. There's one actually in Gardner, Kansas as well, not too far from here, in which if you are heading westbound, you won't have to stop at all at this location. In the future, if the volumes grow enough, we could put a traffic signal in here that would allow people to turn safely left out. Then you would utilize the existing acceleration lane to accelerate and merge into traffic on 23rd Street. Likewise, you would only stop traffic that is eastbound just to serve those vehicles that are turning left out of here. Otherwise, you're treating this a little bit more like a highway, which is what this area is as you're kind of moving out of town. The other traffic recommendation that we have at your first signalized intersection at O'Connell as you come into town, we've got a lot of rear-end accidents that are occurring at that location. That's not unforeseen. You can expect that because you're coming in off a high-speed road. It's the first traffic signal. There are a lot of advanced warning signs that are actually very active and tell you when the signal is about to change, so that you just raise that level of awareness to drivers. And these have been proven to reduce some accidents and those rear-end collisions at those locations. So with that, that kind of concludes a high level. We've certainly got a lot of details that we could go into if you'd like, but happy to entertain any questions. We have staff here as well, and at your direction. So.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
Well, I have one to start with.
Certainly.
What do you think of our complete streets policy and our checklist? Now, be honest about this, you know.
I think I filled that out already. I think it's a good checklist. The key to that is to make sure that you dig in, make sure that you're looking into those issues and have a response. One of the elements of complete streets that we often focus on is it's not that you provide everything on every street.
Right.
It's that you have consideration and a reason why you did what you did, and you work from those locations. One of the discussions we had as an example was whether or not on-street bike facilities should be considered on 23rd Street. With the amount of volumes and the speeds and the amount of trucks, we all recognize that just wasn't a safe option for this facility. That having bicycles that close to the trucks just creates issues. So we need to provide a different facility for them going through there. So the policy is a good one. It's a good checklist to make sure that you understand why you did what you did.
Could you expand a little bit on the comment about bicycle facilities and why they may not be appropriate here?
So
if I understood you correctly.
Yep. So what we've actually recommended is to provide side pass, shared use pass on both sides of the road to provide bicycle accommodations that are buffered and physically separated from the through traffic. Regretfully, if you have bicyclists trying to ride on a street with some of these high speeds, with some of these truck volumes, things can happen. I was actually working at a city once in which the speed of a truck passing a bicyclist, the wind pulled them underneath the truck. Right. So those are things we want to avoid. So when we look at this, it's what's the right decision based on this corridor. And then again, what we see this along 23rd Street is really connecting the north-south routes to the businesses along the corridor as being one of those primary uses. So.
Did you take an inventory of the bike racks in the businesses along this area?
The question was, did we take an inventory of the bicycle racks at the businesses? No, we did not.
Okay.
So I'm not sure we observed too many. We did a walking tour of it, but I can't think of any currently that exist along this corridor. But I'll perhaps defer to staff if they have a.
The redeveloped tractor, heritage tractor, will have some bicycle rack accommodations under the current Article 9 provisions for parking. If you think also the new brewery also has bike rack and accommodation. So a lot of the function of bike rack availability in the corridor is based on two things. One, when it was developed and what the requirements were in the development code. And second, the function of the business, because some of our industrial properties don't have bicycle parking requirements in Article 9.
Well, the question and comment was really, I know there's some destination restaurants. They'd probably like to have people biking, getting there that way. And as Venture Park and East Hills develop, I would think that shared use paths would be pretty desirable to get to and from work. I was kind of curious to see an 8-foot shared use path as opposed to a 10-foot path. I know that 8 feet can be pretty tight in a lot of places in Lawrence, and you know, maybe as we sit here and speak today, we're not going to, you know, I would hope in the future we'd get a lot of bicycles using this corridor to get out east.
And again, that was a conscious discussion that we had and really had to do with
Could
the,
you guys do us a favor and everybody speak into the mics, because we can't hear you back here through the sound system at all. And so if everybody can grab a mic when you're speaking, it would help a lot. The ladies behind can't hear anything.
Can you hear me?
No, we can't. Pull the mic up closer. But if everybody can mic up, the system works well, we just gotta speak.
Okay, is this better?
More.
More? Well, I don't know if I can do much better than that. I'm speaking as loud as I can too, so.
The sound on this side of the room is a little better, so if you're hard of hearing, you might want to move to the side.
Okay, well, I apologize for that. We will do our best, and thank you for that comment. Okay, let's go around here. Carol, do you have any questions? And
Yes, I do.
remember, we're going to get public comment after this, so we can get a little deeper into the comment portion at that point. So I'd like to see us talk about clarifying the plans and questions related to that in this part, if that makes sense.
Well, stop me if I go astray.
Okay.
I have questions on, I understand how you're trying to move heavy traffic like trucks and so forth. I think that's good. What about people who need to cross the street? Are we concerned about that? How are we managing that?
so that's one of the elements as well. When we narrow those lanes, we're shortening the distance it takes to cross that roadway. And then the traffic signals, certainly as those get reconstructed over time, making sure those are timed correctly, and making sure one of the features that I think a few of the signals have are the countdown timers, which are very helpful in communicating that. That is a detail in that design element that will come later that you certainly need to work out. But having those distances there is, shortening those isn't.
And will the cyclist or pedestrian or whatever mode of transportation, will they have to cross the entire stretch, or will they have some kind of refuge in the middle?
So as it stands right now, we don't have this laid out with a refuge, pedestrian refuge at any point along the corridor. So no, we don't have that today.
And how far apart are the intersections where anyone would even think about crossing?
I think the signalized intersections are about a half a mile apart on this corridor. We've identified maybe a few in the future that could shorten it down to a quarter mile in one location.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Catherine? John, you've seen this firsthand.
Yeah, no, I'm good, thank you.
Okay.
Right now. I also worked on the process a little bit too, so I was
Oh,
involved.
great. Mm-hmm. Aaron?
I'm all right for now. I'm interested in hearing public comment.
Okay.
Kind of along Carol's lines, I wanted to understand how people on bikes would get across 23rd Street, not along 23rd Street, and maybe you could start before you leave that Turbo T.
Mhm.
What would be the appropriate way for a person on a bike or an e-scooter to take Franklin, get to the other side of 23rd?
So that doesn't exist at this location. It would actually exist back at Harper Street, which actually has O'Connell Street has bicycle lanes that cross north-south right here at this location. If we go back to the plan, you'll see that here where we have the bicycle racks, or the bicycle accommodations crossing north-south, we have them at Franklin, and we have our trail at this location. We do have future shared use paths in a few other locations as well. So there's a couple different locations where they could be crossing north-south, mostly at signalized intersections. So,
Do people take Franklin now, Jessica? Like, is that part of the bike plan, or is that?
Well, the bike plan's on here also, so I would say it just depends what happens in terms of the alignment out to the east, but that if you're going, depending on what your directioning is there, it could be a possibility. It would still improve connectivity for you, even at a Turbo T, because you would have a signalized intersection to stop at, and you would travel like a automobile in a travel lane, whereas right now there's no signalized, so you're not stopping traffic to have to cross. but, and then to, you know, into the property, you would need to go whatever you need to.
That's what I'm concerned about is if you're on a bike or an e-scooter, to get to the north side of 23rd Street, seems like it might be difficult.
At the Turbo T?
Yeah.
It would be. I would say that if you start to see a lot of activity of that nature, you might want to create that as more of a standard T intersection, but I would also encourage at that point that you relook at the speeds along that section of the corridor, because at 55, introducing another traffic signal would create, again, some issues there. So.
All right, thank you.
I just have one more, and then we'll go on to the public comment.
Yes,
This
sir.
is maybe a detail I'm sure you'll work out. I see how you get from the southbound Burroughs Trail to the shared use path on the north side of 23rd Street. I don't see how you, from either north or southbound on the Burroughs Trail, get to the shared use path on the south side of 23rd Street.
We actually took some time and looked at the configuration to see if, there's a little frontage perimeter road that goes along there.
Yes.
It's not big enough. There's not enough space there to dedicate its own path. You could look at the use of sharrows, for an example, for bicyclists to come up here. But for pedestrians, by and large, we want to take them the safe route. And that would be to come up underneath 23rd Street and to follow the path that exists, and then you'd have to cross at Haskell at that location. It's just, we don't have enough space in there with some of those grades to really accommodate that.
Okay.
But a good observation, so.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we will move on to public comment, and as we stated in general public comment, please come to the podium, sign in, state your name and address, and we'd like to hear you think in terms of a 3-minute time period to get your comments. We have a little flexibility with that, but do the best you can to be concise and to the point, and we'd happy to hear what you have to say. So, public comment.
Okay, hi. My name is Bill Schulteis. I own a couple of the commercial centers along east of Harper. And I did not get the mailing, but it might have been, the county didn't have the records updated from the time I bought it to the time that this started. But I have some things I'd like for you all to consider a little bit. The idea is safety. So we're going to spend millions of dollars and put this road under construction for 2 years, which is going to cost every business along there money, and it will cost the city tax revenue. And is there other ways to go about getting the safety? Why don't we just post reduced speed limit signs and enforce that? Even at some of those places where you're going 45 and 55, that seems pretty fast when you got bicycle traffic, pedestrian traffic, and a lot of lanes turning. The other thing is, we constantly hear about the city. It doesn't have the money to maintain what we have. It's always a budget issue. We're just increasing our requirements for capital or for budget maintenance down the road. The new plans look really nice and clean up in west of Harper, but east of Harper, the median strips explode. If some of you might remember, many years ago, we had median strips on 6th Street in front of Hy-Vee. They all came back out because first they were maintenance, and then people couldn't get into the businesses. Right now, throughout most of town, we have turn lanes, and it seems to be working fine. I believe, and I don't know for sure, but we can probably get some insight today. Most of the accidents are at the intersections where you're stopping, going from 55 to a stop, not out in the turn lanes. The bike lanes, I don't see a need for a 10-foot bike lane. In fact, in front of one of my other properties, we have a 6-foot bike lane, and I've never seen anybody have an accident between a pedestrian and a bicyclist there yet. And I'm wondering, where's all this heavy traffic? Do we want to put in all this heavy traffic on 23rd Street for bicycles? If you, 10-foot lane is going to bring in a lot of bicyclists, and we still have a lot of lights, and we have a lot of driveways. And then it goes from 10 to 8. At the most, I would say 8 would be more appropriate than 10. And I would even recommend, if you have 6 on each side, 6 all the way through. And my last thing is probably not too much about today, but more of landscaping versus screening. You know, a nice little 2-inch caliper tree looks really nice for a few years. Then after about 10 years, you can't see the business. And we do want to promote our commercial businesses as well as the beauty of town. And there's a lot of landscaping along there right now that's required by the city. I believe 2 different commissioners have told me when they're talking about budgets, you know, they're saying like the 2040 plan, residential does not pay for itself, but commercial does. So we don't want to restrict the commercial business because that is a lot of tax dollars coming into the city. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks for your comments.
Hello, Commission. I'm not sure if you remember me, but my name is Luke Smith. I came back in April, and I gave you guys a little presentation specifically on e-boards, and I was delighted to see that last month there was a great meeting discussing everything in terms of e-scooters and further legislation and how we want to handle that. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to attend that one, so I'm sorry I'm not giving this at that meeting, but I had been emailing with Commission Member Bryan, and we had discussed that it'd be a good idea to go ahead and familiarize the commission exactly with what e-boards are in that front.
Could I interrupt you? Are your comments relative to the 23rd Street corridor?
No, sorry. I figured it would have been fine. I know when I originally gave my first public comment back in April, it didn't matter whether
Well,
it was relative to the topic.
it would have been more appropriate to do that during the public comment.
Gotcha.
So, any suggestions? Should we?
We should get that under general public comment. If it's not related to this item, we should
Yeah.
keep the
I'm
focus
sorry,
on
but
this item.
I'd really like to hear what you have to say, but the timing doesn't work. So let's try it again.
All right. So
At
then that
another
would be
date.
next month?
Yeah,
Okay.
that'd be great. That'd be great. Appreciate it.
Yep, thank you.
Sure.
Hey, Commission. I know it's maybe more a planning kind of thing that I'm pointing out or asking about, but I think in some ways it would begin to affect traffic, and that's stormwater, which I don't see anything specifically in what's being presented here today or in the checklist. So we know that our stormwater plan is a little out of date, and we also know that stormwater can become a problem for traffic, you know, in areas like 9th Street, or used to be 19th Street, and maybe in the Allsdale area, where it would become very difficult or impossible to pass those areas with vehicles. So I just wondered maybe some clarification from staff that in building this or designing this, the most innovative use of stormwater plans will be used here. Thank you.
Thanks. Any further public comment on the 23rd Street corridor?
Hello, Commissioners. I'm Scott Zaremba. We own some properties along 23rd Street. And quick comments. We spent 3 days with Olson and their group that were laying out what we needed to do and what they believed we should do on the 23rd Street corridor. We went into that with a lot of other business owners in the area, very tentative about what was going to occur and how it was going to occur. And I have to say that one, I was really impressed with them. We were impressed with how they handled it, how we went through the entire process, and we believe what came out of that process mitigated a lot of the issues that we have there and improved dramatically what we believe is going to be a great corridor coming into town. And so probably the simplest comments I've ever made is they did a good job. They met all of our questions that we had, and they made changes accordingly as we went through it. And I think John was there with us a lot of the time as we went through them, and I was really impressed with them. I'm also impressed with how the city brought them on board and how we've gone through the process. As we've gone through it, this is our 5th or 6th meeting now. I believe we have one more after it goes through your board. But I have to say, everything in there, is it perfect? No. Is it an improvement for where we are? Dramatically. It dramatically improves what we're doing there, and all of the rationale and all of the data they used in order to decide how we did it and what we did, we thought was very strong and good information. So with that, I just want to say thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Appreciate it. Okay, anybody else on this subject, public comment? Thank you, that was all very helpful. So it's back up here and to us. So we started down there the last time, so Charlie?
Well, I have a question actually of staff, or maybe of the consultant. The comment Mr. Schultes made about the medians and crash data, I just would kind of like to hear a response. He suggested that the crashes are likely happening on intersections and not in the middle of the block. Do you have a response to that?
Yes, Jeff McCarrigan with Olson. The majority of the crashes do occur at the signalized intersections, it's true. Where we've utilized medians has been primarily at signalized intersections or on the segment to the east where we had an issue with a median that wasn't being, there was an upgrade over the right in, right out that existed today. We'll just slide that down here. And the other location had to do with correcting an offset intersection that while we're not experiencing significant safety problems today, it's also still a less than ideal design. It doesn't meet current standards. So it's mitigating some of those issues as well.
All right, thank you. Well, my overall reaction, I think that it's vast improvement over the current situation. I like that the speeds, the goal seemed to be to slow people down. I think that's a good thing. I think that the more you travel through an area and spend time seeing it instead of just zooming through it, more likely you'll stop and maybe spend some money there. So I kind of think, I can't imagine that this wouldn't improve the area and its economic activity. Getting to Mr. Schultes' comment, I think the accommodations I'd like to know more about would be the cross traffic getting across 23rd Street. I think that's what we constantly hear from the public is the concern around street crossing. It does seem like if the crossing distance is going to be shorter, that's an improvement. But I think that's just an ongoing concern that we'll always hear. I'm particularly interested in how bicycle lane traffic is going to get across. I think that as more and more people are using bikes to get around, probably crossing the street to visit businesses on either side of the street will happen. So that's all I got.
Great. Aaron?
I think it's better. One thing I've thought about a lot, especially on looking at 6th Street, is when you have a lot of driveways and you have bicycle traffic, there can be some added danger there. So on 23rd Street, and this isn't a suggestion for direction, just an observation, I guess. On 23rd Street, I think that's kind of a conundrum. Ensuring that when people are biking down that, shared use path, there isn't added danger as a result of that many driveways, but not closing too many driveways to restrict access by cars to businesses. So it's just an observation. I think that's it for now.
Okay. Ron?
Well, I will agree. I think that this has been a really good process. I think, the people that were able to participate, I think their voices were heard and acknowledged. I think I have some of the same questions, or, just Charlie and Aaron both bring up that, how is this, still trying to visualize how would this interact with increased, because it's obvious we want to increase bicycle and pedestrian and, multimodal traffic, and how it's going to interact. I know from some of the conversations I have with people, if you're telling me I'm going to have to go a half mile between places where I can cross, I know this isn't the high, there's still quite a bit of retail and restaurants and things going on there, so is that enough? Is that going to be enough, or is that something we're going to have to fix later, or is it something we need to address now? Crossing the road, no matter how you're doing it, other than in a car, that's obviously something that we need to look at.
John?
Yeah, I want to echo what's been said. Being involved in the process, I thought they did a great job, but I share what's already been discussed. I drive up 6th Street every day, and hardly a day goes by that I don't see someone trying to cross in the middle of 6th Street. Now, of course, that's their issue, but if there's a way to make it possible for people, a little shorter intersections, I think that might be a good idea. But, I also am a little bit concerned about all the access, and once you have the increase in bike traffic, as Aaron mentioned, I think you've got a little bit of an issue there, but this is certainly a great improvement over what is there right now.
Oh, I would just agree that this is a great improvement. When you say people don't bicycle on 23rd Street, I don't even drive there. So this is definitely better, but I do ride a bicycle a lot, so the concerns about all the driveways and access, I think, can be handled by clear signage over who's responsible to yield to whom, and making sure that cyclists are aware that there is traffic coming in and out of those. I think the pedestrian concern is greater for the distance between crossings, because riding a half mile or a quarter mile is not as difficult as walking that far just across the street. So I think that's definitely a concern. That's all I have.
I like the realistic approach. It's still kind of highway. We have a lot of truck traffic, a lot of truck traffic type businesses, so this is a good plan for that. I've got a list. First thing I wanted to ask about is I saw two terms. I saw shared use path and multi-use path. Which, are they the same thing?
Yes.
Okay. And then I wondered, when we get to the construction phase, when you have a shared use path, which budget pays for it, cycle or pedestrian?
All of the improvements would be paid out of the same funding source, and it's in our capital improvement plan. I believe the infrastructure sales tax is the partial funding source. The other half is from KDOT turn back money from K-10 to 23rd
Well, if
Street.
it were another situation where we're doing it in-house, what would we do? Would we split it down the middle, or just take it out of one or the other? How would we do that?
If it was a standalone project, bike ped project, it would come out of the bike ped funds.
Okay, they're not separate anymore?
No.
Okay.
We've been splitting them 50-50
Uh-huh.
as a rule, trying to do that, but it's not prescriptive that we need to do that.
Okay, good. I want to respond to some of the public comment. Having the road under construction for 2 years is harmful to businesses. That's why Kmart left. They were torn up all the way around, and they just packed up and left. 23rd Street, O'Reilly's Auto Parts had a lot of trouble. Walgreens had a lot of trouble. It is hard, and if there's anything we can do to mitigate that for the businesses, that would be good. And the reference to 8 to 10 feet, I think we need whatever we can get there, because riding a bicycle or walking is not just for recreation or exercise. Some people, I'm hoping, are going to take it to the industrial park. I'm a walker. I've always been a walker. And to me, walking to work is the thing to do, or riding a bike. And so I think we should just keep that in the plan as best we can. Trees do cover the businesses. If you take a good look at 23rd Street, it's really hard to find Taco Bell or whatever because of all the trees. Perkins has a tree right in front of it. So we need to think about that a little bit, especially since that traffic on East 23rd Street will be going a little bit faster. Stormwater, every east-west street that we have builds up like a levee and spills over and floods to the south. 23rd Street does it, 19th Street does it, 31st Street does it, so East 23rd Street would do it as well. So we do need a stormwater plan. The curb cuts are a definite safety problem, because when the drivers, especially when they're going that fast, to have somebody coming up on their blind spot and they're going to turn, they're not going to see them, so we need to figure that out. Okay, that's my list.
Thanks. Gee, I don't think I have a whole lot to offer in addition to what everybody said. I do think this is a great concept design, and I think we need to keep that in mind. It is a conceptual level at this stage, and I'm sure the intentions are to use the complete street policy and checklist, maybe in more detail and maybe even a little more part of the presentation as we go forward with this. And it's great to see it's been used. That's a big deal to us. I just want to point out that Jackie Carroll, who happens to be on the Sustainability Advisory Board, sent a real nice memo. And I want to make sure that we look at that and you all consider the things she said. She did make some really good comments about landscaping and grass that you have to water, that you have to cut. You know, you all may be way beyond that, and it'd probably be good if it were that way, but I do think landscaping, you see conceptually green stuff, and I get really excited about it, but gee, the functional part of it is such a huge deal in this case. And not just trees, but, you know, even native plants and lower shrubbery can be a problem for bikes and cars trying to get in and out of a frontage road or out of a business. So I think the landscaping is critical to make this something special, but I think it needs to be done correctly and functionally. So unless anybody has anything else, we appreciate it. It's a great job, and we sure look forward to seeing this evolve. So, thanks everybody, and thanks Scott.
Thank you.
Okay, we can move on to item number 4, K10 27th Street, Wakarusa Drive interim safety improvements. We are going to receive a presentation from KDOT regarding the improvements and provide feedback on the design options.
Just scroll down. Gotcha, thank you.
What?
Is Michael out of town? I'm really surprised he's not here. He was adamant at those meetings about being bike paths.
Oh, right. Oh, yeah. I don't know.
Good evening. My name is Aaron Fritz. I'm with the Kansas Department of Transportation. Along with me is Steve Ballman. He's the area engineer out of the Topeka Gauge office. Together, we represent the South Lawrence Trafficway Corridor. We're here to talk specifically tonight about this intersection. That's the prime topic we want to share with you. But I do want to introduce some of the other stuff that's been going on and some of the other items that we've shared with the City Commission previous. So as many of you know, we're currently in a 3-year study for the Supplemental Environmental Impact Study, that statement. We're in year 1, and so we've had a series of public meetings, and we've also had a series of presentations to the City Commission, Douglas County, and the City of Lecompton. That's looking at the long-term improvements, but KDOT also recognized that there was a need to evaluate the corridor for other interim improvements. We did a safety analysis of all the at-grade intersections, and we've had involvement with both city staff, Douglas County staff, and even the Parks and Rec Department. I just want to highlight some of the interim improvements that we're looking at or have already accomplished. Many are aware of the castle closure. We closed that last December at K10. I think the change was a much needed change, and we've had a lot of success. And to date, I think we've only had 2 cars run off the road because they thought they were going onto Castle, but the accidents have dropped dramatically. Additionally, we've had comments about Farmers Turnpike, continued run off the road crashes there. We have a lighting project that's underway to add a light at that intersection. We've already increased the stop signs. Keith Browning with Douglas County has already done that. That's been implemented. Currently, traffic engineering with KDOT and with Steve Ballman are looking at rumble strips to bring awareness to that T intersection. That project is in process. I hope to see it in the coming months. Additionally, we're going to talk about K10 and 27th Street. That was the next intersection identified on the corridor. And then there's 2 other projects. One is a queue warning system. We talked about it last April. You've seen the sensors out on the roadway. The DMS boards were actually put out today, and those hope to be on in the next week or so to provide messages to users approaching this intersection on K10 to allow them to either know that there's slow traffic ahead or stop traffic ahead. So that's in process. And lastly, a more permanent fix is a dynamic message sign, a series of those. There'll be one east of US 59 near the Michigan overpass. There'll be one roughly where the Castle intersection is. And then if you're eastbound, there'll be one between 6th Street and Clinton Parkway, or excuse me, 15th and Clinton Parkway, and then another board as you come down the hill between Clinton Parkway and K10 27th Street. That's a project being led by HDR. We had field check last week, and that project lets next spring. So what brought about this? So we did a 6-month study, which we're about 5 months into, of this intersection. This included Douglas County staff, Mark Hecker with the Parks and Rec, along with the city staff, Dave Cronin and others. We looked at short and midterm solutions because we recognize that the expansion to the freeway of SLT is years off, pending the bigger study, and likewise that we still have a concern about safety and capacity at this intersection. So we undertook this study, and WSP is the lead consultant for KDOT. The expectation is they're working on the draft right now. It'll be provided to KDOT in the coming weeks. In October, we'll present to our executive staff to provide them with an overview of what that project was, what the recommendations are, and then likewise, we will plan on coming back to the City Commission to present the findings of that report. We are still discussing what those midterm and longer term solutions are, and we're waiting to see what the draft study presents. But again, to what we're talking about tonight, so here is K10 and 27th Street, and what I want to bring up is that in the series of public meetings we've had with the Supplemental Environmental Impact Statement, is we overwhelmingly heard that said, yeah, build the 4-lane, but could you do something here? And we heard that over and over and over again. So that's part of the reason we undertook this study. And so we looked at a bunch of interim improvements that we can do. And so consequently, as a result of those meetings with the project team, we're recommending these 7 improvements. Now, these are currently scheduled for a February letting. That letting is also tied to an overlay project of K10 that Steve's staff is doing. So just like they did in Johnson County, they overlaid that section of K10. Douglas County will receive an overlay next year. So this project will be in concert with that to do that timing, to provide cost savings with some of the pavement markings, but also impact the traffic one time. The one thing I will say is that's to be night work, not daytime paving, so that's the one benefit. So you can see here a series of improvements we're promoting. I can tell you that number one has already been accomplished. This was adaptive traffic signal with improved detection. So the current signal only had one series of timing plans. And so what WSB did is they brought one of their traffic experts from St. Louis, and he observed traffic for 2 days, set up a series of timing plans. And so now there's multiple timing plans depending on the day, depending on even event traffic. And so he tweaked the signal over a series of 2 days. And it also provides what we call a dynamic max. So at certain hours of the day, as traffic increases, the length of the signal on the north and south legs extends to provide more time. If anybody's been through this intersection, which most of you have, you know that the detection is only on the immediate section between K10 here and this leg. It can't see traffic up on Wakarusa. It cannot see traffic up on 27th Street. So by providing that dynamic max, it allows more vehicles to get through the intersection. Since that's been implemented, we feel that it's drastically improved the amount of throughput on that signal. Now, it's not going to be the end-all, be-all to solve the traffic issue there, but we do think it's vastly improved the traffic flow, particularly during activities that go to the YSI Sports Complex. So that one was already done independently because it was needed much before a February project. The other two are kind of items 2 and 7 there, and that's the extension and creation of the right turn lanes. So currently, if you're eastbound, there is no right turn lane. Now, often people take the shoulder, much to our chagrin, but we will be expanding the pavement there and creating a right turn lane and carrying that to the west. Now, the westbound movement does have a right turn lane, but it's very short. It doesn't allow for a lot of capacity to make that right turn. So we intend to extend that further to the east to provide more capacity. So that covers items 2 and 7. 3 and 6, if you're familiar with that intersection today, currently this left turn lane is combined with a left and through movement. And that's a lot of times what backs up traffic at that intersection. People are wanting to go through the intersection to get to the sports complex, but they have to wait for any opposing left turners to go. So what we're proposing is to flip those movements to make the right through a separate and then the dedicated left so that more vehicles can get through. Now, likewise on the south leg, there's only one lane today. We intend to add additional pavement there to provide 2 lanes because people do skirt around today on that shoulder. That'll allow for a dedicated right and then a through left. This will better facilitate the traffic signal and will allow more vehicles. This will be accomplished with some pavement markings. That's about the extent of the change. So that covers items 3 and 6. Now, the biggest discussion we want to share tonight, and the one that's probably most controversial, are items 4 and 5. So we'll start with 5. Currently, that pedestrian crossing is immediately in front of all vehicles that are turning. And we want to provide more separation between the PEDs crossing, allow better sight distance for those that do that maneuver. And so it's in our opinion that we move this farther to the west and create a new sidewalk so that there's more separation for those turning vehicles. But the bigger change would be all these yellow delineators you see here. That's item 4. So currently, all movements are facilitated, but we recognize that there's a lot of hesitation between vehicles when they're stopped at 27th and they're stopped at Wakarusa wanting to turn left or right respectively. What even WSP conveyed to us is what they observed during peak hours is that because they have to come to a stop and not yield, they often hesitate, and then by the time they do decide to move, a vehicle comes off a K10. And so that creates further delay in the signal. It really eliminates a lot of the benefit of that green time during the signal. So what we're proposing is to restrict 2 of the movements. Now currently you can go from Wakarusa here in this lane and cross through the intersection. Likewise, the other is you're able to turn left from 27th Street into this. Our goal here is to provide a yield condition which would allow 2 lanes to queue into this. Additionally, we're going to add a camera on this signal that will view this intersection so there'll be more detection. But likewise, this through movement will be allowed, but there would no longer be this left turn movement, and again, a yield condition. We acknowledge that that's going to put some added stress on the neighboring streets, Inverness and the other street that goes around around the apartment complex. But we figured this was a fair trade-off considering one of the other options would have been to close the intersection altogether at 27th and allow only this left and right turn movement here. So those are the proposals that we have to modify. We greatly feel like this will improve the intersection. It operates at level service D today. After these improvements are made, we'll see level service A on 27th Street and a level service C on Wakarusa. Additionally, we'll see a reduction, anticipated reduction, almost 2 crashes per year, and the benefit cost ratio for this is close to 11. Like I said before, this echoes a lot of the feedback we've received at the public meetings about this intersection, about pedestrians and bikes crossing, being able to get into the sports complex, hence some of the bike ped maneuvers. And again, this is based on staff feedback, both from Douglas County, the city, and the parks. The other thing I do want to mention that we've worked about the Parks Department about is there's been a lot of discussion because this is the only ingress-egress point to the sports complex. And there's currently a proposal in the capital improvement project to extend 27th Street up underneath the dam and allow access that way. And we've talked to Mark Hecker about that numerous times. That's a project we fully support, and we want to continue to work on that. But that would allow an interim two access points into that sports complex. Again, in the ultimate, once the freeway is built, there will be a secondary access through the Wakarusa interchange, and likewise, this will be maintained when we take K10 over. I know that was a lot to cover in a short amount of time, but at this point, that's what we wanted to share with you tonight, and I'll entertain any questions you may have.
I just have one real quick question. On your parts, on Part 4 specifically, was there any thought given to doing something temporary, setting up something that's just to see how traffic flowed with that? You know, like I know we played around a little bit with some, when we were looking at 19th Street and some of that. Was there any consideration to that, or is that?
We had not discussed putting it up temporarily to see how it functioned. I mean, one of the comments that WSP recommended is you would want to try to do all of these things together to really get the benefit.
Gotcha.
It's not something we wouldn't consider, but it hasn't been discussed to date.
Okay.
I have a couple of questions. When you add, on number 2, when you add that right turn lane, you're going to have traffic coming in who might just take that as a sort of a free right turn without having to stop. And I was wondering, like when the pedestrians and the cyclists are trying to cross there, that would put them at risk. So is there any thought about making, setting the lights so that the cars have to stop when pedestrians and cyclists are crossing that intersection? Do you see what I'm?
Sure. So the current is a free right on green. And currently pedestrians cross here. So this actually separates that issue today, because the pedestrians cross here.
No, I'm talking about the right turn lane on number 2 on the second thing.
Right, the eastbound right here.
Right.
That, oh, excuse me, this eastbound right separating.
Correct.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So if I'm coming across there on a bicycle and I have a green light to cross the highway, but there's now a new right turn lane and the driver of that car is just looking to make that right turn, there's nothing to stop them, or, you know, they're not looking for cyclists or pedestrians, they're just making a right turn.
So if this is an eastbound right turn maneuver on green, the pedestrian,
It's on green only?
no, I'm saying if this is green, this movement's not allowed. There's the peg crossing, the signal won't trigger the walk sign if K10 has a green.
I know.
And so they have to come to a stop on red when this ped maneuver is occurring.
Okay. Promise me they will. Okay. And then on the other part of it, I do like moving the crossing number 5 where you cross Wakarusa. I like moving that away from that intersection because currently no one stops at that stop sign even when it's clear that people are trying to cross in that crosswalk. So I was wondering, are there going to be signals that can be pushed so that the pedestrian or the cyclist can actually stop traffic?
Yeah, there's still ped activated there.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a rectangular rapid flashing beacon.
Yeah, but it's not a stop. It's not.
It's not a stop. No.
Right. Okay. That's my question. I'm not sure
Isn't
that's.
the plan was a RFB.
I believe so, yes.
I go through this intersection a lot, and the drivers look you right in the eye, and they don't stop, and they just crash on through, even though the signage right now is clear that they are
Right.
supposed to stop and yield to pedestrians and cyclists, and they don't do it. And there's traffic. I like having it offset, but I would like some way of at least making it clear that they need to let.
Right, I
us
mean, the
through.
hope is when you have stacked traffic here, that's a slower movement for those pedestrians to cross instead of the urgency that people have to make that turn maneuver.
Okay. And then, I know it's hard to think ahead of when this becomes the 4-lane freeway, but what is the thought about getting pedestrians and cyclists across there? Is there going to be some kind of underground or overpass?
So in the freeway condition, K-10 will go over 27th Street.
Okay.
And so pedestrians and bicyclists will be able to move freely because then the only intersection they'll have to deal with is Speaker Road or crossings in the sports complex.
Yeah.
So eventually we'll separate and we'll take K-10 traffic over.
But I agree, this intersection is confusing for everyone. Nobody seems to know right now what they're supposed to do, so everybody just kind of all goes at once, and it's pretty frightening, so.
I think you had a great question, and I'm not sure I understood the answer. To the traffic, the cars on K-10 that are traveling east.
Yep.
In that lane number 2.
Yep.
So when a bike or pedestrian has a green light to cross there, you're saying that the cars will have to stop?
Yep, because the signal will be
And they
red
can't take a,
for
they can't take a
eastbound
right
K-10.
on,
I'm sorry.
they won't be able to take a right on a red light?
Well, they can take a right on red, they have to stop first.
So that is, Catherine, that's what you're concerned about, isn't it?
Right, I'm not sure they will stop
Right.
first, and what kind of thing are we building in to help them remember to stop first?
Well, the issue I have is that today people use that shoulder as a right turn
Right.
lane. So we have this condition to date that they would turn against pedestrians. This better delineates that and provides that dedicated right, because the reason they're doing it is that because the eastbound movement is stacked up the hill, they're wanting to make the right turn. They don't want to wait. So, yes, they could turn against pedestrians, but they should stop first before they make that movement. But today it's uncontrolled because they choose to violate the law and take the shoulder.
Do they have a problem seeing pedestrians?
They don't look for pedestrians.
'Cause
Drivers
they're
don't
looking to
look,
see if they can
they
turn
look
right.
for other cars.
And they're not, it just seems like you were gonna have 2 other cars there potentially
Getting in your
seeking to
line of
turn
sight.
left or go straight, and they're not gonna be looking across that, crosswalk.
Mhm.
They're gonna be looking,
Would it be unheard of to just have a no right turn on red?
It could be proposed. It's something we'd have to talk with our traffic section about, particularly, I mean, we've done it on things such as a DDI. We prohibit that movement. It's something that can be done.
It's really hazardous for slower moving pedestrians and cyclists, because the cars just roll around the corner, they don't stop.
Right.
and at least from observations, seems like a lot of the cyclists crossing there anyway are very small.
Yeah, there are a lot of children
Children,
because of the sports complex.
Right. And obviously, that's going to continue until the freeway grade separates. And so the intent was to do as much as we could for now, because we can't prevent that movement today.
I have one, are the speed limits 70 miles per hour?
It's posted at 65.
65.
Mhm.
And when you approach the lit intersection, the speed limit doesn't reduce?
No.
Okay.
So, as I mentioned, some of the interim treatments we're implementing, one's the queue warning system for queue backup, but the other is eventually when we add the dynamic message signs, we'll replace that queue warning with signal ahead, like we have at Crossgate today. So we'll implement that on the highway so that it will notify you if the signal's about to change.
Just to add an element to that, it's one that's going to be interconnected with the signal system. It will, if they're get it put together right, basically it's going to start flashing signal red ahead or stop ahead prior to it actually going into the yellow mode. To give people plenty of forewarning leading up to the intersection, the visual indication that they need to start slowing down. And this is well back. This would be back where you see the stoplight ahead sign currently.
Well, the
So
comment.
it's going to provide the additional forewarning to get people into the stop condition.
Well, the comment I was going to make, and, not understanding technically in detail what you're saying, if you hit the button and you're biking or walking trying to get across 10 here, and it goes green and it says walk, and you look up in either direction and you see somebody quite a ways down the road going 65 miles per hour, I wait probably halfway through the green signal before I'm convinced that somebody's really going to stop there. And I think, it just scares me to death when somebody's, a biker or anybody is just looking like this and they see it go green and they go. I'm like, you know what I mean? So, I'm assuming that what you're describing will temper the traffic that's coming up to the intersection soon enough that it would be visible to slow people down, so we can use the whole time we need to get across the road.
That's the intent behind the flashing beacon that's going to provide the stop ahead condition and forewarning that traffic. Goal is to gather their attention and get them slowing down instead of waiting to the last second.
And that would also help Catherine's concern about the right turn people. I mean, right turns on bikes is one of the scariest things to have to deal with, but you deal with it, But I'm happy to hear that the signalization will improve that. And
I think the way it is currently, the part that I have the most trouble with at that intersection is once I get across the highway, then I have to cross that intersection, and that's where nobody stops right now. I just get off my bike until it turns into its bottleneck, and then I go through that because no one stops. So I think that's an improvement, but I think adding that right turn lane has created another hazard, so something to think about.
Okay, maybe we should go into public comment on this. Thanks. Good job. Yes, please come up.
I'm Deborah Zare, and I live in the Larkspur Circle neighborhood. Just we're the first place you can turn when you're going east on 27th Street after this big death trap that we have going right now. And so I am so happy that something is going to be done in the interim to help address some of these problems. I go through that intersection 2 to 4 times a day. I try to avoid it when I can, and then I'm going up through that neighborhood, and they don't need our traffic up in there. So this is great, and you all had that meeting at Southwest Junior High a few months ago, and I was very appreciative of the listening ear and the willingness to share technical things with lay people like me, and so I'm happy with this, and the sooner we can get something done, the better. Because I know that bicyclists may not feel respected at any intersection, much less something like this. But I just have to say that there's so much congestion that sometimes it's difficult for everyone, and it's scary for everyone. Bicycles are most vulnerable, as are pedestrians, but I'm just really glad that we're addressing this. The one thing I don't clearly understand, because this is the first time I've seen this and heard this, so, it's in the evening, I haven't had supper yet, so whatever. But, so we're in that Larkspur Circle neighborhood, just to the east, on 27th. It's a private drive. We maintain it, we pay for it, we do all this stuff. I just want to know whether we would have a temporary glut of people turning around to go back the other way, or, you know, that sort of thing, whether it be temporary or, you know, ongoing because of the change. And not to say that I don't think the change should be made, but what might be done to mitigate the potential negative impact on our particular little neighborhood where we maintain the streets. And we know hundreds of cars could be turning around at this intersection if the situation is not just right. So that would be my primary concern.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Would one of you want to address that?
Well, I mean, to be honest, we can't control driver behavior on where they turn around. We acknowledge that Inverness is likely the best solution for people to turn right and then go north up to 23rd Street and come back. I would look to the city about what ordinances they have about those turnarounds, because again, we're restricting the movements at this intersection, but as to where they choose to turn around, if they go to Inverness, if they go to the north-south street. I know with city staff, we talked about maybe some parking restrictions need to be implemented, or signage for the, I forget, Dave, maybe you remember the north-south road just to the east, Scottsdale. Whether or not some restrictions need to be on that roadway. But again, you know, the actual turnaround point where the driver would make, as long as they're not doing it to block up intersection traffic here, that would be our biggest concern.
Okay. Dave, Chuck, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I just echo what Aaron said about driver behavior. We can't control it. You know, the delineation at the intersection will be what we call sticks and bricks. People can still drive over them, drive around them. They will do that. They did it at Castle. We're trying to delineate it the best we can for what we expect driver behavior to be. We can, as resources are available, have enforcement out there if it does become a problem. We do think this is a better alternative, though, than what is out there today. So it's not the best situation, but I think it's something that that we're willing to try out. And if it completely didn't work, we could discuss with KDOT if modifications could be made, or if additional signage is needed, or additional things on the city street network would help the public navigate the area. So they're all good comments and things that we kind of talked about as we've gone through our meetings with KDOT. We'll monitor the situation.
Okay, great, thank you. Is there further public comment on this item? Okay, it's back up here. Gee, I think this is a big improvement, you know, has its shortcomings for sure, but just moving that pedestrian path to the west is a big deal in my mind. Further, Commission? Okay.
Still concerned about that right turn lane, but I think that's 65-mile-an-hour road and already enough trouble with right yields.
Any green paint involved in this?
There's no plans for green paint. We'll discuss with KDOT the ability to have a no right on red, if that would be appropriate at the intersection. That was a good point brought up and something that we can look at.
With 35-mile-per-hour traffic is one thing. With 65-mile-per-hour traffic is a totally different thing. So, okay, I hope we've been helpful. And if there's nothing further, let's just go ahead and move ahead to item number 5, non-motorized project prioritization. I'll bet Jessica's got this one.
Jessica Martinger, Transportation Planning Manager, NPO. I'm back again with some options for you. So I didn't go through the whole rewrite of the memo, but we've given you back 3 options for the section 2 of the non-motorized prioritization policy for the pedestrian access. So I'll just kind of introduce you to those, and then we can have a discussion, and I'd be happy to answer anybody's questions they had back about the policy or any other discussion we didn't have at this point about that. We looked at our previous option 1, which is based on buffers, and had no prioritization, and had some prioritization based on buffers and distances. This is in the existing approved policy. Based on feedback and conversation we had, we developed a cumulative points system that added access to destinations. After the reflection of some of the conversation you had last week, there was a little bit of concern about the distraction or the removal of some of the prioritization around schools and the conflicting nature of that with the priority that the community set around safe routes to schools and the conversation we hear from the public about pedestrian access in neighborhoods. So we came up with a 3rd option for you, which is a little bit of a mix of the second one, but it weights schools to an equal priority. One of the problems why schools wouldn't show up even if it's multiplied 2 or 3 times in the prioritization process is because there's only 37 schools, whereas all of the other destinations, there's over 4,000 to 5,000. So this is a conversation I think that really puts into scale and perspective for you if you're talking about vulnerable users and still prioritizing projects around schools versus solely looking for just cumulative destination making. And this is kind of the mix of both of those conversations in terms of having a map that would score points for pedestrian access to destinations. So I'd be happy to entertain any questions you might have about why we got to these or questions you might have about deciding which one to move forward with.
Would it be fair to, is that the big change, what you just described between what we saw last month and this month?
Yeah. So this number 2 is the same one you saw last month.
Okay.
Number 3 is the new option where you've asked us to come up with one more kind of thinking about some of that and really to show you when we started to look at those school destinations is, you know, can we just make them doubly important or triply important, or how do you scale that? But the reality is you have to basically multiply them times 60 to get them to have an equal weight based on the number of other destinations, the quantity of the other destinations. And so we did that here. We equalized them to the other destinations. And you can see it pulls back around the schools and in some neighborhoods, some priorities. So it doesn't just keep it on our arterials and in downtown. It's just a different way to think about how we want to prioritize which destinations in the scoring that you use as the starting point for non-motorized prioritization. We also provided you, which for your information, we can talk about any projects you want, but we have for each option the scoring. And then you can see kind of the different ones that have been selected, not always the top score, you know, based on funding or other considerations. Some projects, the lines were merged together. So like this project might have been joined with another project. So it doesn't have a score in the new models because of how the lines were reworked when they costed projects. So that if you saw some without future scores, that's kind of what I've been told happened there. I'm not the one responsible for editing all those lines. But I asked that question. If there was something you were looking at to do.
There's one on Castle that, yeah, the option 2 and 3, there's no score at all.
And I would assume that the Castle, that's what I got told, is that it got added to another line. So projects weren't removed, but that some lines, when they put them in originally, it could have been broken up in a bunch of different pieces. Well, the reality when they go out and cost that project is you're not going to build one section of that. You're going to build a longer section of that. So they costed it as one single project instead of 2. But in the original model scores, they didn't go back and rerun the existing model because we know we're not going to use it. So we use these existing scores that were already run from the previous time.
I like this. I think it gives us a lot more flexibility that scores when I'm just glancing through here, some of the things that got low scores in our current model suddenly got higher scores. I mean, it just feels like it's going to give us a better opportunity for discussion about where to invest the money that's allocated.
Anybody up here want a question before we open it up to public?
Oh, sorry. I just didn't have a question there.
Okay. Public comment?
Good evening. I'm Tressa Hill, 705 Tennessee Street. At your August 5th meeting, I asked you to test some outcomes. I wanted to thank you for that effort. The downtown cluster shown in option 2 with the cumulative points is not an outcome we expected and appears to diminish the priority of neighborhood projects, which is our goal. I was trying to show overall that the draft policy diminishes the priority of neighborhood projects in favor of projects on high-volume trafficked streets. There are 21 points available when a project is prioritized. Projects with street traffic of 15,000 cars a day get 10 points from Section 3, plus points from Section 1 and Section 2. Neighborhood projects, often for children's safety, which fall on collector streets or less, are at an immediate disadvantage. Neighborhood projects could be lucky to receive 2 points from Section 3. So projects with street traffic of 15,000 cars start the process with 8 or more points ahead of the neighborhood projects. Crossing Tennessee, Owl's project received a total of 11 points, for example. In conclusion, we hope you continue to test the outcomes to support your decision-making. It's really helpful. Cumulative points, option 2, diminishes the priority of neighborhood projects. We're not supporting them. We are asking for a policy that supports and focuses on neighborhood projects and a policy that gives more points when children's safety is at risk. Maybe not just schools, but parks and pools too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello again, Courtney Shipley. I'm not sure that I have anything particular. It was good to see these maps. I think that was really helpful. I think something that also might help me, and maybe that would just be a little bit of research on my part, is to take a project that we all know is successful and that we have implemented and see how it would fare going through this process. So thinking off the top of my head, things that might have been, you know, the school crossing in front of Sunset. If you put that in one of these formulas, how would it have fared? Or some of the traffic circles in University Place neighborhood, how would they fare going through these different options? So things that we all agree, I think generally would agree, are working and are successful. Maybe that would be a metric that would sort of help us see how it would play out with something we agree on. That's just a suggestion. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, that appears to be the end of the public side. Thanks. Back up here.
I like map 3 because the neighborhoods each of them has a school. So we're spreading our attention out again.
Catherine? Anybody?
No, I agree. I like Courtney's suggestion also of thinking about, kind of making better sense of this, looking at places we could say, yeah, that's a good investment. You know, would that have gotten 10 or 11?
Mm-hmm.
And that would just help make intuitive sense of the policy. And then I kind of agree also with Teresa's comment about there might be other destinations. In particular, the pool is, you know, a clear destination that draws a lot of young people every summer. So I don't know that every park is equal in that regard, but I think the pool is probably something that most everyone would agree draws a lot of kids. Of course, the library, which is right next to the pool, also makes sense. So maybe that's not to count that twice, but maybe just that area should kind of be considered in the same way a school might be considered. I think we just have to keep that in mind, that, you know, we probably don't have a single category that we can say is all equal, but schools, for the most part, I think we can say that, so.
Jessica, didn't you say last time that there's always the option to do something that's not in the matrix?
Absolutely. So I think the non-motorized the thing to remember is the policy, the non-motorized prioritization policy, is supposed to be a starting point to provide you some data instead of just trying to make a decision based on a list of 200 projects, to say, based on some different data points, that's a collection of points and scoring, here's what comes out at the top. If you look and kind of see on the project scoring sheet, you can see which ones have been selected and or completed, and those aren't necessarily and haven't been always the highest scoring projects. And so I think the staff recommendations already and what you've approved have already reflected that conversation and that sentiment, that it's a starting point in the conversation, and you can choose to prioritize other programs or projects. The challenge always becomes on staff's behalf is trying to build a program that fits within budget. So automatically you can't necessarily just say take the top so many projects, because you are building a piece of the pie that you have to get everything to fit nicely together with the funding that's allocated each year for project sets. So
I think we should go with map 3. I don't think we should spend a whole lot more staff time on it, as long as we have the caveat of being able to do something different if we see the necessity.
and that's written into the policy.
Well, I think we've talked about this for a long time, and I'm trying to imagine where we would be without it and how difficult what you guys are asking us to do would be without this. And maybe the first year we were sitting up here, that's what was going on. And I can remember throwing my arms up a few times, really. And this really moves it along. And I totally agree with the idea that this is a starting point, and a great starting point for a conversation. It's not the end of the discussion. So I think we're there. Anybody else? I agree. Okay, go ahead. Well, I would entertain a motion as requested to approve this.
So I think we're looking for adoption of the policy as drafted with the substitution of option 3 for the pedestrian demand access to destinations.
Yeah, I think that's, when I thought of like what we're aiming for, I mean, I think it's important as a starting point, you know, this is sort of what we're aiming for, but recognizing that in those neighborhoods where it may not be bright red, you might still want something to go in there, but this is like just looking more at priority. So I think this is a.
You're talking option 3.
Option 3, yes, sorry. The one I'm pointing at, obviously.
Yeah.
I can see it.
I'll move to.
Turn screen, so.
I'll move to approve approve the non-motorized project prioritization policy TC 19-001 and recall the non-motorized projects prioritization policy TC 18-001.
Second.
Motion by Charlie, second by Catherine. All those in favor, raise your hand, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you. Okay. Item number 6, we're looking at the ordinance and bylaws that we talked about a couple months ago, and Dave and Chuck.
Yeah, if you remember, we brought to the Transportation Commission a review of your establishing resolution 7172, which is attached, and asked you to review that in terms of, you know, the membership, number of members, and other things. You made the recommendations that you wanted to change the name to the Lawrence Multimodal Transportation Commission, and that all appointments be made by the mayor at large. And so, you know, the person from the BAC and from the school district and from, you know, the various organizations that you were originally appointed from, that's going to be removed, and it will be all members at large. So we've got the ordinance drafted, and that's what we're asking you to recommend approval to forward on to the city commission. And then we've updated the bylaws to reflect the same changes. Now with the ordinance, because we've changed the makeup of the membership, you all have to be reappointed. So at the same time, the mayor, it's obviously her choice, but the recommendation will be to reappoint you to fulfill your remainder of your terms. So hopefully that goes as smoothly as what I said, but you never know. So anyway, so what we're asking tonight is for you to take a look at those ordinance and the bylaws, and if you're satisfied with them, then recommend us to send them forward to the commission for approval.
Okay. Carol, do you have any questions, comments on this?
I was just looking to see if we wanted to put anything in here about how a person gets an item on an agenda, or would we rather not?
In the bylaws?
Because
The bylaws are intended for the board, how you run your meeting. It's not process or procedures on how to get people or items into the meeting, which, you know, we have a number of ways to do that.
Okay.
It's just
Yeah, I
how you
think-
run your meetings, who's the chairman,
Yeah.
his duties, the vice chair, stuff
Right.
like that. That's what the bylaws are really for.
I think we have a process in place for that, so. Catherine, any? Okay, anybody down here?
No,
John?
sir.
Public comment? Okay, it's back up here. For me, I think, did you want to?
I was just going to move approval unless you
Well,
want to speak.
I just wanted to say that I think this is consistent with our discussions.
Right, that's,
And I think it's exactly what we asked for, and I'm real happy with it. So, with
I
that,
would move approval.
Second?
motion,
I guess provide the recommendation to the
Carol? Okay.
city
Yes.
commission.
motion by John, second by Carol. All those in favor, raise your hand, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Passes unanimously. Staff items.
All right, I got one item. Last week, we got the notification of the next round of the KDOT Transportation Alternatives Program grant funds. So it's pretty similar to previous years. They have $7 million in their program for federal fiscal year 2021. The applications are due November the 1st, so it's a relatively short turnaround time for the city to select and prioritize what applications we want to submit for the program. I'd anticipate us to bring this up at the October meeting, some recommendations on projects to submit for, and get your feedback on that at the next meeting. And then as far as back to the timeline, the award is in spring of 2020 when they would announce what projects were selected. So it's an 80-20 split, 80% federal funds, pass through the state, and then 20% local match. So that will be coming up, and so we'll bring you a list of projects to consider. When we made the application last time, we applied for 3 safe routes to school, which we did not get. A shared use path along 6th Street from Monterey Way to Wisconsin was one that we had submitted for, did not get. And then the Lawrence Loop from Hobbs Park to Constant Park, or to the depot. That's the one that we did get funds for, which we're currently working on design for. So that's, if you recall, those are the type of projects that they're looking for applications for this program. So we bring in some options next month.
If I recall, the discussion last year was primarily, do I recall correctly, we had about 6 projects that you all considered, and you came in with a recommendation of 2 or 3 with an explanation as to probably, I think, a higher probability to get accepted or not. Is that generally what we're going to be looking at here?
Yeah, I think last year, or when we did this last, we did have a little longer list. We narrowed down a few we didn't think were very competitive. Then we brought the 3, right. And then a lot of the discussion on the 3 was how should we rank them 1, 2, and 3? Because they did, in previous programs, did ask us to rank them 1, 2, and 3, which is always really hard, which is what's the number 1 priority. They're all good priorities. So we had a lot of discussion on the last round of how we were going to rank them. We'll start with the list of non-motorized projects that we have, and probably start at the top of the list with the scoring, and then look at the costs and the applicability to the scoring system that they have, and then provide some recommendations based off that. But we'll bring several and then have a discussion on those pros and cons of how each project may score, and then make a recommendation.
So we need, you'll need action in October on this.
Correct.
In order to get these in by November.
Correct. Yep, November 1st is the deadline.
Okay.
And we'll need some time to staff time to put the applications together. I mean, a couple of them we submitted for before, and the Safe Routes to School has been a program that for an application we've submitted the last 3 or 4 times, and so it's, I'm sure that will be included in the list. But if there are other projects we haven't submitted for before, we'll take some time to put together, a couple of weeks. So
I would just comment that we ought to look carefully at the agenda for October, considering 19th Street. And this would probably be could potentially be pretty lengthy and detailed discussions. So for what it's worth, let's consider that. Any other questions on that? Okay, to us.
Hold on just a second.
Oh, okay.
I'm just thinking about timing for when we're going to talk about, now that the prioritization policy is, we have a new one. When are we going to talk about the prioritization of projects for 2020? Is that after October?
we have it on the calendar in November.
Okay.
As a placeholder for November, so I think we could be ready by November. I don't know if we could be ready by October for that.
I guess I'm thinking as we consider the TA grant, we need to pay attention, there's probably a set of projects that are going to be most fundable, or that might have a better chance of being funded with KDOT's criteria, that may be very different from our discussion about prioritization based on the policy we just kind of accepted. So just keep that in mind, I think.
Okay.
What we think is important may not be what KDOT would score, would rate projects in the same way. So we got to just be open to the idea that, it's not, they're not gonna fund what we want necessarily.
Okay. Item number 8, commission items. I guess Nick isn't here to talk about PTAC, and I'm guessing they probably haven't met. But do you guys have any information?
Not on PTAC, no.
Okay, okay. And micromobility subcommittee update. Charlie, you want to take a shot at that? Since
Sure.
Nick's not here.
Since Nick isn't here. So we've had 2 meetings, and we're meeting again this Friday and then the following Friday. The meetings are several hours, so we're trying to get as much as we can done in a short amount of time in order to bring something back to this commission for consideration with the goal of having an RFP for a pilot ready for, I believe, December. Does that sound about right? But we might have a draft in November.
Yeah, we were, tentatively, we were trying to come up with a draft by November for here.
And so we've decided that we'll each review a few RFPs from around the country, not all over the country, but in communities we thought were most relevant for our situation. I don't know who's all done that reach out, but I reached out to Kansas City, Missouri. They had an RFP issued last December, and I think we had one from Omaha. We have another one from Wichita, maybe. We're also looking at Fort Collins, and I can't recall the others, but there's a list that we created with the idea that we would study the RFPs, and then this Friday come back with kind of our attempt to say, you know, these are the things, elements we liked from each RFP, and give that recommendation to staff for them to start putting together an RFP from our for our community. One thing we decided early on was to try to make some progress. We had to be really narrow with the scope, and we talked quite a bit the first time we met about all the things that might matter, and it just was clear that we have to prioritize the e-scooter thing first, and then keep in mind that there's probably other work that needs to be done around this broader concept of micromobility, which includes privately owned vehicle, devices. I think that was probably a good choice. We got a little distracted, I think, again by that same issue on last Friday with, you start to think about all the other issues that we need to address, but like the fact that bicycles and e-scooters essentially follow the same set of rules, and then it called into question, like, should bikes have certain, should we change some of the rules around how bicyclists are supposed to use the roads and rights of way? I don't know, Carol, do you have anything else to add that maybe?
No, that pretty much covers it.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, thanks a lot. I have just one quick comment I'd like to make, kind of in a general nature. It was interesting a couple of weeks ago to see that Bob Nugent had resigned and is moving on to Topeka, and obviously there'll be a search for Bob's replacement. And we've talked quite a few times over the 3 years, 2.5, 3 years we've been here about transit not really seeming to be that connected to the Transportation Commission. And I think that my comment would be, and anybody can add to it if they choose to, that, given a new search and a new person in this role, it may be an opportunity to have a different kind of connection between transit and this group. And that's all I really want to say. I mean, it's just really a comment and hopefully an opportunity to explore how this might, affect us. And to the extent that you guys can keep us appraised of how that search is going and how it's looking in terms of possibly the profile of the person that may be in that position would be real interesting. It just seems like all this stuff is changing so quickly. And It's going to change before our eyes, and I think that's something that would be helpful.
I'll just add, I think that this is quite a time in our country where transit as we know it and public transportation just broadly is changing. And, you know, we're seeing it with this discussion about shared micromobility devices. I hope this is an opportunity for the city to think about how transportation is managed in the entire community, whether that's, you know, public, private, or public-private partnerships. It seems like there's a lot of things in play. So whoever's hired is hopefully someone has a broad view of how to help people and goods get around a community, and thinking about mobility as kind of our primary concern, and not someone who's kind of steeped singularly into managing buses. I think that's probably not the direction we need to take. So I'm looking forward to seeing who gets hired and how that process of hiring goes.
Yeah, me too. Okay,
I have one small comment.
okay.
Last time I talked about Parks and Rec offering most of their classes at the Rock Chalk, so that folks on the east and the southeast side of town had trouble getting to those courses. And I'm always watching for equity issues. I guess it's part of my background. And right after our meeting last time, I read where people who were coming to football games were going to have free parking and a $1 bus ride to and maybe from the game. And I'm thinking, here we are willing to help out people from out of town, and we're not willing to help our own. Or at least that's what it looked like from the newspaper. So I just thought I'd point that out, that we should be watching for equity issues.
Great, thanks, Carol. All righty, calendar items, item number 9. Dave?
Well, on the calendar, we had set aside a study session to update you on our sidewalk maintenance program. We are giving an update to the city commission tomorrow night on proposed changes to that in the study session that they have, so we'll see what comments come out of that. But that program is, staff's making some recommendations on revising that, so we may be able to update you on that in October. On the regular meeting, we had the Castle 22nd to Clinton Parkway project. After talking with our consultant on that project last week, I think we're going to push that to November's meeting. We do have the East 19th Street project, Haskell to O'Connell design options, which will be on the agenda for October. And then, as I mentioned earlier, with the Transportation Alternatives program, I anticipate having that on the regular meeting agenda for October. And I guess I would entertain any questions on the calendar.
I would, oh, go ahead,
I was
Charlie.
just going to ask on the study session for December, is that still looking like a likely topic?
You said December?
Yeah,
The ADA transition plan update? I don't believe so. We are, I don't know if it's, we're in the process of hiring an ADA coordinator. I don't know if that person's been announced yet.
Okay.
But maybe selected, but, so that, realistically, for them to get on board and get going on that, I don't know if we would be ready by December for that. So something that may get plugged into that instead that month. I did get with Jasmine. I think the question came up last meeting or in the meeting before about sustainability, and so she was thinking maybe early next year would be a good time for her.
That's what I was going to make a plug for. I was thinking the ADA thing might be delayed, so the sustainability also might having that sooner is not possible, or?
Well, I think the the star transition to lead and the scoring, the way that's gonna work, I think she was thinking that she might not have all those answers till early next year.
All right.
Works for me. I think the STAR program is what got my attention
Mm-hmm.
and how we could participate in that. Okay, I would just make one comment about the October agenda. I think we ought to consider putting 19th Street like the first item on the agenda. And I would expect a lot of public comment, and I just think it'd be good to do that up front if we could. If that makes sense to you guys.
It does.
Okay. Item number 10. i.e. adjournment. Anybody want to take a shot at that?
I move that we adjourn. Second?
Moved by Catherine, second by Aaron, that we adjourn. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed?
Charlie, you gonna buy a hoverboard now?